Some men grow flowers, but he grew graveyards. They called him the gentle gardener, but the soil knew otherwise. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker and truth cuts colder than fiction. I'm so glad you're here. Wherever you're watching from, you're part of this family. These stories are made for those who crave truth in the quiet hours. A simple comment or subscribe helps them travel farther and keeps the truth alive. So, have you subscribed yet? I'm waiting. Done? Great. Thank you. I want you to know that every click and comment counts, and you are very important and highly welcomed here. This is the story of Miguel Cortez Miranda, the gardener who planted bodies. The year was 1982, and the quiet neighborhood of Azcapotzalco in Mexico City was about to learn that evil doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it whispers through garden gates and smiles over fence posts. Sometimes it wears the face of the man who tends your roses. Miguel Cortez Miranda was that man. The gardener everyone trusted, the neighbor who never raised his voice, the husband who seemed devoted to his family. But beneath his calloused hands and sun-weathered face lay something far darker than the earth he turned each morning. For years, he had been cultivating a garden of horrors, and when authorities finally unearthed his secrets, they discovered that some monsters don't lurk in shadows. They thrive in broad daylight, pruning hedges while their victims decompose just feet away. This is the story of Mexico's forgotten killer, a predator so methodical and patient that he turned his own home into a graveyard. A man who understood that the best place to hide the dead is among the living. And when the truth finally clawed its way to the surface, it would reveal that the worst nightmares aren't the ones that chase you through darkness. They're the ones that wave to you every morning from across the garden wall. Welcome to the story of Miguel Cortez Miranda, the man who proved that monsters don't need fangs or claws. Sometimes all they need is a shovel. So, are you ready? Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Miguel Cortez Miranda was invisible in the way that working men often are, present but unnoticed, functional but forgettable. In the sprawling industrial landscape of Azcapotzalco, one of Mexico City's oldest boroughs, he blended into the background like mortar between bricks. His hands were perpetually stained with soil, his clothing simple and worn, his demeanor quiet to the point of being forgettable. Neighbors would later struggle to recall specific conversations with him, only vague impressions of politeness and an almost mechanical efficiency in the way he maintained his property. The house on Calle Norte 87 was modest, even by the working-class standards of the neighborhood. Concrete walls painted in fading yellow, a corrugated metal roof that rattled during rainstorms, windows perpetually shuttered against the harsh afternoon sun. But the garden was Miguel's masterpiece. While other properties on the block settled for sparse patches of grass and the occasional potted plant, Miguel's yard flourished with an almost unnatural vitality. Bougainvillea cascaded over the walls in explosions of magenta and orange. Roses bloomed in disciplined rows, their petals thick and lustrous. Hibiscus flowers opened like red mouths toward the sky, and beneath it all, the soil remained perpetually dark and rich, as though fed by some secret abundance. Miguel had moved to the property in 1975 with his wife, Maria Luisa, and their 2 young children. To the outside world, they appeared to be another struggling family trying to carve out survival in an indifferent city. Miguel worked irregular hours as a gardener and handyman, taking jobs throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Maria Luisa stayed home with the children, rarely venturing out except for necessary errands. The family kept to themselves, which in a neighborhood where everyone kept to themselves meant they attracted no particular attention. But isolation breeds opportunity for those with certain appetites. The first victim disappeared in 1976, though no one connected her vanishing to the quiet gardener on Calle Norte 87. Her name was Rosa Martinez, a street vendor who sold flowers near the Camarones metro station. She was last seen accepting a ride from a man driving a small white truck. Rosa was a fixture in the area, known for her bright shawls and weathered hands that could arrange flowers into small miracles. When she failed to appear at her usual corner, people assumed she'd returned to her village in Oaxaca or had simply moved to a different location. The city swallows people whole on a daily basis, and Rose's disappearance generated no more than a few concerned questions before the neighborhood moved on. Miguel continued his routine, up before dawn, tending his garden as the sky shifted from black to gray to the pale yellow of a new day. He would spend hours among his plants, speaking to them in low murmurs that neighbors occasionally overheard but never quite understood. Some found it endearing, the gentle gardener who loved his flowers like children. Others found it slightly unsettling, though they couldn't articulate why. There was something about the intensity of his focus, the way he could kneel in the dirt for hours without straightening, without pausing, as though mesmerized by something only he could perceive beneath the surface. His wife became a ghost in her own home. Maria Luisa's face grew thinner year by year, her eyes developing the hollow quality of someone who has learned to stop asking questions. She kept the children inside more often than seemed necessary, even during pleasant weather when other kids played in the streets. When neighbors did encounter her, she offered thin smiles that never reached her eyes and hurried conversations that ended as quickly as possible. Some women in the neighborhood whispered about bruises they'd glimpsed beneath her sleeves, but no one intervened. Domestic matters remained domestic, especially when the husband was as quiet and unassuming as Miguel Cortez Miranda. The second victim vanished in 1978. Her name was Patricia Guzman, a young woman who cleaned houses in the wealthier neighborhoods north of Azcapotzalco. She'd been saving money to bring her daughter up from Puebla, working double shifts and sleeping in the homes of her employers when they traveled. Patricia was careful, cautious, not the type to accept rides from strangers or take unnecessary risks. But one evening in November, she failed to arrive at her employer's home. Her few possessions remained in the small room where she slept, her daughter's photograph still propped on the nightstand. It was as though she had simply evaporated between one moment and the next. Miguel's garden grew more spectacular. The roses became the envy of the neighborhood, their blooms impossibly large and deeply colored. He began winning small prizes at local garden competitions, modest acknowledgments that filled him with visible pride. He would stand among his plants during these judging sessions, his weathered face creasing into rare smiles, his hands gesturing toward specific flowers as though introducing old friends. The judges marveled at the richness of his soil, commenting on how unusual it was to achieve such fertility in Mexico City's notoriously difficult growing conditions. "What's your secret?" one judge asked him, kneeling to examine the dark earth around a particularly magnificent rose bush. Miguel's smile remained fixed, his eyes unreadable behind the glare of afternoon sunlight reflecting off his glasses. "Dedication," he replied simply. "You have to feed the soil properly. Give it what it needs. Nothing more, nothing less." The judge nodded, impressed by the simple wisdom, and never thought to ask what exactly Miguel fed into that remarkably dark, remarkably rich soil. The third victim disappeared in 1980. This time it was Carmen Velasquez, a widow who lived 3 blocks away and occasionally hired Miguel to maintain her small garden. She was meticulous about her schedule, attending daily mass at 6 in the morning and keeping her social calendar written in careful script in a notebook she carried everywhere. When she missed mass 3 days in a row, the priest sent someone to check on her. The house was locked, her belongings undisturbed, but Carmen was gone. Police questioned neighbors, including Miguel, who expressed appropriate concern and mentioned that he'd last seen her a week prior when he trimmed her hedges. He seemed genuinely troubled by her disappearance, his brow furrowed with worry, his hands fidgeting with the gardening gloves he perpetually carried in his back pocket. The investigation went nowhere. Carmen Velasquez joined the growing number of Mexico City residents who simply vanished, her case file buried under thousands of others in police archives that no one had time or resources to properly maintain. Miguel's behavior began shifting in subtle ways that only his family noticed. He became more particular about his garden schedule, refusing to deviate from his routines even for important family matters. He started spending entire nights in the yard, working by the light of a single bare bulb hanging from the back wall. Maria Luisa would watch from the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around cold coffee, observing her husband as he dug and planted and moved through the garden with the focused intensity of someone performing a sacred ritual. The children learned to stay away from their father's garden. There was an unspoken rule in the household, communicated through glances and sharp whispers rather than explicit commands. The garden was Miguel's domain, and no one, absolutely no one, was to disturb it without permission. In 1981, 2 more women vanished within months of each other. Both were last seen in Azcapotzalco. Both were working-class women who existed on society's margins. Women whose absences generated reports but not investigations, questions but not answers. The neighborhood began to develop an uneasy awareness that something wasn't right, though no one could pinpoint the source of their discomfort. People started looking over their shoulders more often, walking faster after dark, warning their daughters to be careful, to stay in groups, to avoid strange men. But Miguel Cortez Miranda wasn't strange. He was familiar. He was the gardener with the magnificent roses, the quiet neighbor who kept to himself, the devoted husband and father who worked hard to provide for his family. He was invisible in his ordinariness, camouflaged by his very normalness. The soil in his garden continued to deepen and darken, fed by secrets that would remain buried until the day his wife finally found the courage to speak the words that had been strangling her for years. That day was coming, though Miguel didn't know it yet. He knelt among his roses in the fading light of another Mexico City evening, his hands deep in earth that held more than roots and minerals, and believed himself untouchable. Believed that his careful planning and methodical execution had created the perfect hiding place. Believed that the dead, once planted, stayed planted. He was wrong. The year 1982 began with unseasonable rain that turned Mexico City's streets into rivers of mud and overwhelmed drainage systems designed for a smaller, simpler city. Water pooled in the streets of Azcapotzalco, creating mirrors that reflected the gray sky and made everything seem doubled, duplicated, as though reality itself was splitting at the seams. Miguel watched the rain from his kitchen window with growing anxiety. His jaw clenched tight enough to ache. Water was an enemy to his carefully maintained garden, a force that could disturb what should remain undisturbed, shift what should stay settled. For 3 days straight, the rain pounded down with relentless fury. Miguel spent hours each day in his garden despite the downpour, ostensibly checking drainage and protecting his plants. But neighbors who glimpsed him through the sheets of rain noticed something frantic in his movements. He would dig in certain spots and then fill them back in. He would stand motionless in the center of his yard, water streaming down his face, staring at the ground as though he could see through the soil itself. Maria Luisa watched her husband's deterioration with a mixture of fear and something darker. Hope, perhaps, that whatever was consuming him might finally consume him entirely. Their marriage had calcified into a silent war of endurance. She knew things about Miguel that she dared not speak aloud, not even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts. She had learned to read his moods in the tension of his shoulders, the particular way he cleaned his gardening tools after certain nights, the careful attention he paid to specific sections of his beloved garden. The rain finally stopped on the 4th day, but the damage was done. One corner of Miguel's garden had partially collapsed, the soil giving way to reveal something that shouldn't be there. A glimpse of fabric, the unmistakable curve of what might have been bone. Miguel discovered it at dawn, his face going pale as paper when he understood what the rain had exposed. He stood frozen for a full minute, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities, before springing into frantic action. He worked throughout the morning, digging and rearranging, his movements jerky with panic. But he wasn't alone. From the kitchen window, Maria Luisa watched, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she had always known but never admitted. Her husband wasn't tending a garden. He was maintaining a graveyard. The realization should have shattered her, but instead, it clarified something that had been crystallizing in her chest for months. She was living with a monster, and if she didn't act, she would either become his next victim or spend the rest of her life as his accomplice in silence. The choice presented itself with absolute clarity, and for the first time since she'd married Miguel Cortez Miranda, Maria Luisa chose herself. She waited until he left the house 2 days later, telling her he had a gardening job in a nearby neighborhood. The moment his truck disappeared around the corner, Maria Luisa grabbed her 2 children and what few possessions they could carry quickly, and walked directly to the police station on Calle Camarones. Her heart hammered so violently in her chest that she thought she might collapse on the sidewalk before reaching her destination. But fear of staying outweighed fear of leaving. The officer at the desk was young, bored, barely looking up when she entered. Maria Luisa had rehearsed what she would say, but when she opened her mouth, the words that emerged were simpler and more devastating than any speech she'd prepared. "My husband has been killing women and burying them in our garden." The officer's pen stopped moving. He looked up, really looked at her for the first time, taking in her thin frame, her haunted eyes, the way her children pressed against her sides like small animals seeking shelter. The station seemed to go quiet, though Maria Luisa knew this was impossible. Her perception had simply narrowed to this single moment, this irreversible declaration. "Senora, that's a very serious accusation. Are you certain?" "I'm certain." Her voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in years. "I've been certain for a long time. I'm ready to tell you everything." The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed, perhaps because the case was so horrifying that it cut through the usual bureaucratic lethargy, or perhaps because Maria Luisa's testimony was so detailed and specific that it left no room for dismissal. She told them about the women Miguel had mentioned in passing, about the nights he spent in the garden, about the smell that sometimes drifted from certain areas of the yard despite his constant addition of lime and fertilizer. She told them about finding women's jewelry hidden in the back of his closet, pieces he'd sworn he'd bought for her but that she'd never seen before. She told them everything, unburdening years of complicit silence in one devastating flood of truth. 2 days after Maria Luisa's report, a team of investigators descended on the house on Calle Norte 87. Miguel wasn't home. He'd sensed something wrong in the atmosphere when he'd returned to find his wife and children gone, and had fled. But the garden remained, and the garden, investigators would discover, had been waiting to tell its story. The first body was discovered within 30 minutes of excavation, the second within an hour. By the end of the first day, they had unearthed 4 victims. By the end of the week, the count reached 7. 7 women, ranging in age from 19 to 53, all buried at various depths throughout Miguel's carefully tended paradise. Some had been there for years, reduced to skeletal remains wrapped in deteriorating fabric. Others were more recent, their bodies still in states that made identification possible but made the investigators sick with horror. The neighborhood transformed overnight into a spectacle of morbid curiosity and repulsed fascination. News crews camped outside the police barriers, their cameras capturing every load of earth removed from the property, every flag marking where another body had been found. Neighbors who had once admired Miguel's green thumb now stood in clusters, faces pale with shock, trading stories and theories. How had they not known? How had they walked past that house every day, admired those roses, and never suspected that beauty was growing from butchery? The flowers themselves became objects of horror. Those magnificent roses, those lush hibiscus blooms, the bougainvillea that had won him prizes, all of it fertilized by decomposition, nourished by the slow breaking down of human remains into mineral components that fed roots and stems. The garden wasn't Miguel's sanctuary. It was his storage solution, his way of disposing of evidence while surrounding himself with beauty grown from his own brutality. Forensic anthropologists worked carefully through the soil, documenting every discovery, photographing every position. The victims had been buried with no ceremony, no respect, simply placed in holes and covered over. Some were nude, their clothing removed and presumably destroyed. Others wore the outfits they died in, now rotted and stained beyond recognition. Personal effects were sparse. A bracelet here, a wedding ring there, small tokens that the victims had carried with them into their final moments. As the excavation continued, investigators began piecing together victim identifications. Rosa Martinez, the flower vendor, was among them. Patricia Guzman, the house cleaner. Carmen Velasquez, the widow from 3 blocks away. The other 4 took longer to identify, requiring dental records and missing persons reports cross-referenced across years of inadequate police documentation. They were all women who had existed on society's periphery, women whose disappearances hadn't generated sustained attention, women who Miguel had specifically chosen because he understood that certain lives are considered more disposable than others. The question that haunted investigators was how. How had he lured them? How had he murdered them? How had he managed this for nearly 6 years without detection? Maria Luisa's testimony provided some answers. Miguel had been patient, careful, selecting victims who fit specific criteria. Women alone. Women without strong family connections. Women who worked irregular hours and whose movements were difficult to track. He would offer help, a ride, a job opportunity, assistance with something heavy. His appearance worked in his favor. He looked harmless, weathered by labor, the type of man who exists in every working-class neighborhood. The actual murders, Maria Luisa believed, happened quickly. She had heard sounds from the small shed in the back of the garden on certain nights, brief struggles cut off abruptly. Miguel was strong from years of physical labor, and he had the advantage of surprise. He would wait until they were in the shed, ostensibly to show them tools or discuss gardening work, and then strike. Maria Luisa had never witnessed the actual killings, but she had seen enough aftermath. Miguel scrubbing his hands for long minutes, burning clothing in a barrel behind the house, working through the night to dig and plant and rearrange. "Why didn't you report him sooner?" Investigators asked her repeatedly, their tone hovering between sympathy and accusation. Maria Luisa's answer never changed. "Because I was afraid. Because I had children to protect. Because I thought if I pretended not to know, if I just kept my head down and stayed quiet, he would never turn on us. I was wrong to wait so long, but I wasn't wrong to be afraid." The manhunt for Miguel Cortez Miranda intensified. His photo appeared in newspapers and on television broadcasts across Mexico. Police received numerous tips, each one requiring investigation and most leading nowhere. Miguel had disappeared as completely as his victims once had, vanishing into the vast anonymity of Mexico City's sprawling neighborhoods and surrounding communities. But Miguel wasn't a sophisticated criminal. He was a gardener who had gotten away with murder through patience and careful victim selection, not through brilliance or elaborate planning. Without his garden, without his home base, he was adrift and increasingly desperate. He had some money saved, but not much. He had no contacts in the criminal underground, no network to help him disappear permanently. 3 weeks after the first body was discovered, Miguel made a critical mistake. He returned to Azcapotzalco, drawn back to familiar territory despite knowing it was dangerous. He needed to retrieve something. Money he'd hidden, documents he thought he might need. The exact reason was never fully established. What mattered was that a neighbor spotted him near the house, recognized him instantly despite the beard he'd grown and the hat pulled low over his face, and called the police. The arrest happened quickly. Miguel was cornered in an alley 3 blocks from his former home, trapped between 2 police vehicles with nowhere to run. He didn't resist, didn't fight, simply stood with his hands at his sides as officers approached with weapons drawn. Up close, they saw that he looked exhausted, hollowed out, aged a decade in just 3 weeks. His hands, those famous gardener's hands, trembled visibly. "Is it true?" one officer asked as they handcuffed him. "Did you kill those women?" Miguel stared at the ground, at the concrete beneath his feet that was nothing like the rich, dark soil he'd spent years cultivating. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "My garden was beautiful. Everyone said so. The most beautiful garden in the neighborhood. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough." The officer felt his stomach turn at the pride that flickered briefly in Miguel's voice when he spoke about his garden, that graveyard disguised as paradise. Miguel Cortez Miranda was driven away from Azcapotzalco in the back of a police vehicle, watching through the window as his neighborhood disappeared behind him. People lined the streets to stare, their faces twisted with disgust and fascination. He had been invisible for so long, and now he was all anyone could see. The monster who had hidden among them, the killer who had grown his reputation along with his roses, the the man who had proven that evil doesn't need to announce itself when it can simply wait, patient as a seed in dark soil, for the perfect moment to bloom. The interrogation room in Mexico City's Judicial Police Headquarters was deliberately uncomfortable. Harsh fluorescent lights that hummed with an electrical whine, a metal table bolted to the floor, chairs designed to be just unstable enough to keep suspects off balance. Miguel Cortez Miranda sat with his hands folded in front of him, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall slightly above his interrogators' heads. He had been silent for the first 2 hours, responding to questions with nothing but occasional shrugs or one-word answers that provided no useful information. Detective Ramon Escalante had been working homicides for 15 years, and he'd learned that there were 2 types of killers, those who couldn't wait to talk about what they'd done and those who would take their secrets to the grave if permitted. Miguel appeared to be the latter type, withdrawn into some interior space where the interrogators couldn't reach him. But Escalante had a strategy for breaking this particular kind of silence. "Tell me about your roses," Escalante said, changing tactics entirely. "I saw photographs of them. They really were magnificent." Something flickered in Miguel's eyes. Interest, perhaps, or the memory of pride. "The Gloria Day variety was my favorite," Miguel said after a long pause. "Hybrid tea rose, yellow petals edged with pink. Very difficult to grow in this climate, but I managed it." "How did you manage it?" "That must have required special care." Miguel's posture shifted slightly, his shoulders relaxing by increments. For the first time since the interrogation began, he made direct eye contact with Escalante. "The soil is everything. Most people don't understand that. They think if you just water a plant and give it sunlight, that's enough. But it's what's beneath the surface that determines whether something will thrive or die. And your soil was exceptional. It was perfect." There was unmistakable pride in Miguel's voice now, a crack in the facade of silence that Escalante immediately recognized as an opening. "Walk me through it. How did you make it perfect?" What followed was a confession unlike any Escalante had heard before. Miguel didn't confess to murder directly, he confessed to gardening. But in describing his meticulous process for maintaining his garden, he revealed everything about how he had disposed of his victims. The lime he added to accelerate decomposition, the strategic locations he chose for burial based on which plants would benefit most from the nutrients, the careful rotation system that ensured no single area of the garden received too much enrichment at once, the timing of his planting schedule that coincided with his acquisition of new materials. He spoke about human bodies the way a farmer might discuss compost, with clinical detachment and practical consideration of their utility. The women whose lives he'd taken had been reduced in his mind to their chemical components: nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, trace minerals. He genuinely seemed to believe that he had honored them in some twisted way by transforming them into something beautiful, that the roses that bloomed from their remains were a kind of memorial. "Did they beg?" Escalante asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the rage building in his chest. "When you killed them, did they ask you to stop?" Miguel's expression clouded, discomfort finally penetrating his enthusiasm for horticultural discussion. "I don't remember the details. It happened very quickly. I made sure of that." "Why them? Why those specific women?" "They were alone. No one was looking for them very hard. And they were." He paused, searching for words. "Available. They accepted my help. They trusted me because I looked harmless." The chilling pragmatism of this answer sent a cold current through the room. Miguel had calculated his victims' worth based on social isolation and vulnerability, selecting them with the same care he applied to choosing rose varieties. He had understood, with the instincts of a predator, that certain women occupied spaces in society where their absence would generate questions but not investigations, concern but not action. "Did you feel anything when you killed them? Remorse? Excitement?" Miguel considered the question with apparent seriousness. "Satisfaction, I suppose, not from the killing itself but from completing something. Each burial was like planting a tree or a perennial. You put it in the ground, you tend it properly, and then you watch it grow. The women became part of something larger than themselves. My garden was famous in the neighborhood. People came to admire it. They took photographs. I won prizes. The complete absence of empathy in his voice was more disturbing than rage or evident sadistic pleasure would have been. Miguel Cortez Miranda was a black hole where normal human emotion should have existed, a void that had consumed 7 women and transformed them into fertilizer for his obsession. As the interrogation continued over multiple sessions, a fuller picture emerged. Miguel's first murder had been partially accidental. A confrontation with Rosa Martinez that escalated when she refused his advances and threatened to report him. He had panicked, struck her with a shovel he'd been carrying, and realized only after she stopped moving that he'd killed her. The burial had been pragmatic at first, a way to dispose of evidence. But then he'd noticed how magnificently the roses grew in that particular spot, how lush and vibrant they became, and the seed of a terrible idea had taken root. The subsequent murders were premeditated, planned with the same care he applied to his garden maintenance schedule. He would identify potential victims, women he encountered through his gardening work or neighborhood activities. He would establish minimal rapport, offering assistance or expressing interest in helping them with some task. Then he would isolate them in his shed, kill them quickly, usually through manual strangulation or blunt force trauma, and bury them before dawn the next morning. His wife's growing awareness had troubled him, but he'd believed he could control her through fear and the implicit threat to their children. He had never explicitly threatened Maria Luisa, but he'd made sure she understood that certain questions should never be asked, certain areas of the yard should never be examined too closely. The fact that she'd finally broken and reported him had shocked him more than his capture. In his narcissistic worldview, he'd convinced himself that she was complicit, that her silence meant acceptance rather than terror. Psychologists brought in to evaluate Miguel struggled to fit him into established profiles of serial killers. He lacked the sadistic pleasure that characterized many sexual predators. He showed no evidence of the grandiosity typical of narcissistic killers who wanted recognition for their intelligence. He wasn't driven by voices or delusions that might suggest psychosis. Instead, he seemed to exist in some unique category. A killer whose primary relationship was with his garden rather than his victims, who murdered not out of sexual desire or power fantasies, but out of a twisted understanding of utility and beauty intertwined. If you could go back and make a different choice, would you? A forensic psychiatrist asked during one evaluation session. Miguel thought about this for a long time, his face impassive. I would have been more careful with the drainage, he finally answered. The rain exposed what shouldn't have been exposed. That was my only real mistake, not accounting for extreme weather conditions. The psychiatrist realized with chilling clarity that Miguel genuinely didn't understand that the question referred to his choice to murder, not his choice of burial methodology. The distinction between moral action and practical execution simply didn't register in his mind. Meanwhile, the investigation into Miguel's victims continued. The 7 women buried in his garden were identified, and their families, those who could be located, were notified. The grief that followed was complicated by time and the horrific circumstances of the deaths. Some families had spent years hoping their missing daughters, sisters, mothers might still be alive somewhere, and the confirmation of death, though terrible, brought a kind of closure. Others had already held memorial services, already processed their grief, and now had to reopen those wounds with the knowledge that their loved one's final resting place had been a killer's garden. One victim's sister, Elena Martinez, sister of Rosa, the flower vendor who had been Miguel's first victim, requested to meet with him. Against the advice of both her attorney and the investigating detectives, she insisted on this confrontation. The meeting was arranged under strict supervision, conducted through security glass with guards present. Elena sat across from Miguel, her hands clenched in her lap, her face aged by grief and anger. My sister was a good woman. She sold flowers to support her children. She never hurt anyone. Miguel looked at her with genuine incomprehension. I know. She had very good taste in flowers. We talked about carnations, I remember. She preferred the red ones. You murdered her. You buried her in your garden like she was garbage. Not garbage, Miguel corrected, his voice containing a note of offense. Garbage is waste. I never wasted anything. Rosa became part of something beautiful. People admired the roses that grew where she rested. Elena lunged forward, stopped only by the security glass between them, her voice rising to a scream. She was a person. She had children. She had a life. You took everything from her. Miguel seemed genuinely puzzled by her rage. But she wasn't using that life anymore. I made sure she continued to contribute. Isn't that better than simply rotting in some forgotten cemetery? The guards ended the meeting immediately, restraining Elena as she broke down, her screams of fury and grief echoing through the facility. Miguel was led back to his cell, his expression troubled not by the pain he'd caused, but by the apparent inability of others to appreciate the logic of his actions. The trial, when it finally began 8 months later, was a media sensation. Courtrooms were packed daily with journalists, curious observers, and family members of the victims. Miguel sat impassively throughout the proceedings, showing interest only when photographs of his garden were displayed as evidence. His defense attorney mounted a case based on diminished capacity, arguing that Miguel's unique psychology rendered him unable to fully appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. The prosecution countered that his meticulous planning, victim selection process, and years of successfully avoiding detection demonstrated clear understanding of both the law and social norms. Testimony from Maria Luisa proved devastating. She described her years of living in silent terror, knowing what her husband was but feeling trapped by economic dependence, fear for her children, and the knowledge that speaking out might cost her own life. She broke down multiple times on the stand, her voice cracking as she described the smell of lime drifting from the garden, the way Miguel would come to bed with soil still under his fingernails, the nightmares she'd had of roots growing up through the floor of their house, thick with the nutrients of decomposition. "Did you love him?" the prosecutor asked her during a particularly intense moment of testimony. Maria Luisa looked at Miguel for a long moment before answering. He met her gaze with no visible emotion, as though she were a stranger rather than the woman he'd shared a bed with for 7 years. "I don't know if I ever did," she finally said. "I thought I married a man, but I don't know what I actually married. Something that looked human but wasn't. Something that could smile at neighbors in the morning and bury bodies in the evening and never see a contradiction between those actions." The verdict, when it came after 6 days of deliberation, surprised no one. Guilty on 7 counts of murder. Guilty on 7 counts of improper disposal of human remains. The sentence, 250 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Mexican law at the time. Miguel showed no reaction when the sentence was read. His only question to his attorney afterward was whether he would be allowed to maintain a garden in prison. He was told that he would not. The small plot he would be permitted to tend, if his behavior warranted such privilege, would grow only vegetables, and those would be carefully monitored to ensure no special fertilization occurred. For the first time since his arrest, Miguel showed genuine emotion, not remorse or fear or even anger, but something closer to grief. His garden, his masterpiece, his life's work would be destroyed. The house on Calle Norte 87 had already been bulldozed, the soil treated as hazardous material and removed for proper disposal. Every plant he'd nurtured, every rose he'd coaxed into bloom, every carefully placed stone and precisely trimmed hedge, all of it erased as though it had never existed. "My roses," he whispered to himself as guards led him from the courtroom. All those years of work. The victims' families, listening to this final lament, understood with renewed horror that Miguel Cortez Miranda mourned his lost garden far more than he regretted his murdered victims. To him, the women remained nothing but components in his horticultural achievement, and their humanity, even in death, even in the face of life imprisonment, continued to be secondary to his obsession with cultivated beauty. The neighborhood of Azcapotzalco struggled to recover from the revelation that a serial killer had operated undetected in their midst for nearly 6 years. The house on Calle Norte 87 became a grotesque tourist attraction in the weeks following Miguel's arrest, with curious onlookers driving slowly past the police barriers, pointing and taking photographs. Some people left flowers at the property line, tributes to the victims that created a bitter irony given the nature of the crimes. Eventually, the city ordered the property demolished entirely. The house was razed, the garden excavated down to bedrock, and the entire lot treated with chemicals before being filled with clean earth and eventually paved over to create a small community plaza. No one wanted to remember the garden of Miguel Cortez Miranda, but forgetting proved impossible. The case had exposed uncomfortable truths about how easily certain lives could disappear, about the inadequacy of missing persons investigations, about the ways in which entire communities could exist adjacent to horror without recognizing it. The 7 women Miguel murdered hadn't vanished because of his brilliance. They'd vanished because society had already rendered them partially invisible through poverty, isolation, and systemic indifference. Maria Luisa and her children were relocated to another part of Mexico City through a victim assistance program, given new identities and psychological counseling to help them process the trauma of their years living with a monster. But the damage Miguel had inflicted on his family went deeper than any therapy could easily reach. His eldest daughter, Carmen, developed severe anxiety that manifested in an inability to be around plants or gardens. The sight of turned soil or the smell of fertilizer would trigger panic attacks so severe she required hospitalization on multiple occasions. His son, Javier, became obsessively protective of his mother and sister, sleeping with a knife under his pillow until he was 17, unable to trust that his father wouldn't somehow escape and return to finish what he'd started. Maria Luisa herself existed in a state of complicated grief. She mourned not for Miguel. That man, she insisted, had never truly existed except as a mask worn by something predatory, but for the years of her life consumed by fear and complicit silence. She attended support groups for families of criminals, sitting in church basements with women whose husbands or sons had committed terrible acts, all of them struggling with variations of the same questions. How did we not know? What signs did we miss? Could we have stopped it? Are we guilty too? I knew, Maria Luisa told her support group during one particularly raw session, 2 years after Miguel's conviction. I keep saying I didn't know for certain, that I only suspected, but that's a lie I tell myself to sleep at night. I knew. I could smell death on him some mornings. I found pieces of jewelry that weren't mine. I heard sounds from that shed that no gardening work explains. I knew, and I said nothing because I was afraid, and because saying it out loud would make it real in a way I couldn't undo. The other women in the circle nodded with understanding born of similar admissions. They had all drawn lines in their minds between suspicion and knowledge, between fear and responsibility, and they all understood that those lines were far blurrier than society wanted to acknowledge. Maria Luisa's testimony had helped convict Miguel, and for that, she was labeled brave by prosecutors and media. But late at night, alone in the small apartment where she now lived, she didn't feel brave. She felt like a woman who had purchased her own survival with the lives of women she could have saved if she'd acted sooner. In prison, Miguel Cortez Miranda adapted to his new environment with the same methodical patience he'd applied to gardening. He kept his head down, avoided conflicts, and earned minor privileges through good behavior. Other inmates largely avoided him. Even in a prison housing murderers and violent criminals, there was a hierarchy of acceptable versus unacceptable crimes, and Miguel's particular brand of killing made him repulsive even to hardened convicts. He existed in a kind of social isolation which seemed to suit him fine. He had never been particularly interested in human connection. His one persistent request was for access to gardening materials. He wrote letters to the prison administration explaining how a garden program could benefit the facility, providing fresh vegetables and teaching inmates useful skills. His letters were detailed, persuasive, and completely ignored. The warden had made clear that Miguel Cortez Miranda would never be permitted near soil or growing things for the duration of his incarceration. The risk, both symbolic and practical, was too great. Denied his garden, Miguel retreated into elaborate fantasy. Other inmates reported hearing him late at night, speaking in low murmurs as though conversing with plants that only he could see. He would trace patterns on the concrete walls of his cell with his fingers, describing the layout of gardens he was planning in his imagination. Guards who monitored him noted that he seemed to be designing different gardens for each of his victims, elaborate memorial spaces that existed nowhere but in his deteriorating mind. A psychiatrist who conducted periodic evaluations described Miguel as suffering from a form of dissociative detachment that allowed him to separate the humanity of his victims from their utility in his gardening projects. He genuinely doesn't process them as people, the psychiatrist wrote in his report. He has reorganized their existence in his mind into purely functional terms. When he thinks of Rosa Martinez, he doesn't recall her as a woman with children and dreams. He recalls her as the enrichment source for his prize-winning Gloria Day roses. The disconnect is so complete that I'm not certain traditional rehabilitation methods would ever bridge it. The report concluded that Miguel would never be suitable for release under any circumstances, not because he was actively dangerous in the traditional sense, but because he lacked the fundamental psychological architecture required to understand why his actions were wrong. He could recite the legal and social prohibitions against murder. He understood intellectually that society condemned what he'd done. But at a core level, he remained convinced that he had created beauty through efficient use of available resources, and that the problem wasn't his actions but others' inability to appreciate them. 5 years into his sentence, Miguel agreed to participate in an extended interview with a criminology researcher studying serial killers with unusual motivations. The researcher, Dr. Gabriela Santos from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, spent 3 months conducting recorded sessions with Miguel, trying to map the psychological landscape that had produced such an unusual killer. "When did you first think about killing someone?" Dr. Santos asked during one session. Miguel considered the question carefully, his weathered hands folded on the table between them. "I never thought about killing specifically. I thought about my garden, about making it perfect. The killing was just a necessary step in the process, like pruning diseased branches or removing stones from soil before planting. But these were people, not branches or stones. They became part of the garden. Isn't that a form of immortality? My roses will outlive all of us, if someone is caring for them properly." He paused, genuine concern crossing his face. "Someone is caring for them, aren't they?" Dr. Santos had to inform him that his entire garden had been destroyed, the property paved over. Miguel's reaction was visceral. He became agitated for the first time in the interview process, his breathing rapid, his hands trembling. Guards stepped forward, preparing to intervene, but he gradually regained control, sinking back into his chair with visible effort. "All of it?" he asked in a near whisper. "Even the bougainvillea? That took 7 years to establish properly. All of it. The entire property was demolished." Miguel closed his eyes, and for a moment, Dr. Santos thought she might be witnessing actual remorse, the first crack in his pathological detachment. But when he spoke again, she realized her mistake. What a waste. Those plants never hurt anyone. They were innocent, and they destroyed them anyway, just to punish me. He mourned his garden. Not his victims, not the families he'd devastated, not the community he'd traumatized, but the roses and hibiscus and bougainvillea that had been sacrificed to his crimes. The complete inversion of appropriate emotional response confirmed everything Dr. Santos had theorized about his psychological structure. Miguel Cortez Miranda existed in a moral universe entirely his own, one where cultivated beauty justified any atrocity and where the deaths of 7 women mattered less than the destruction of ornamental plants. Dr. Santos's research, published 3 years later in a prominent forensic psychology journal, used Miguel's case to explore what she termed utilitarian psychopathy, a subset of antisocial personality disorder where victims are dehumanized not through hatred or sadism, but through reduction to purely functional objects in service of the perpetrator's obsessive goals. The paper generated considerable academic interest and became required reading in several criminal psychology programs. Miguel Cortez Miranda, who had spent years trying to become famous for his garden, achieved a different kind of recognition, as a case study in how completely a human mind could disconnect from the fundamental value of human life. Meanwhile, the families of his victims continued their own difficult journeys toward whatever healing was possible. Some found solace in advocacy work, pushing for better missing persons investigation protocols and increased resources for cases involving vulnerable populations. Elena Martinez, Rosa's sister, became a prominent voice in this movement, testifying before legislative committees and speaking at community forums about the systemic failures that had allowed her sister's disappearance to receive minimal investigation. "My sister sold flowers on a street corner," Elena said during one particularly powerful speech to a gathering of victims' rights activists. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't politically connected, she wasn't the kind of person whose disappearance makes headlines. And because of that, when she vanished, the investigation lasted maybe 3 days before her case was filed away and forgotten. Miguel Cortez Miranda understood this. He selected victims he knew wouldn't be looked for very hard. He weaponized our society's indifference to certain lives. If we want to prevent another Miguel, we need to stop creating the conditions that make their crimes possible. The speech was recorded and shared widely, becoming a catalyst for modest reforms in how missing persons cases were prioritized in Mexico City. It was small progress, insufficient to address the scale of the problem, but it represented something. A refusal to let Miguel's victims be forgotten, an insistence that their lives had mattered beyond their utility to a killer's sick obsession. In the neighborhood where Miguel had lived and killed, time slowly performed its erosive work on memory. New families moved into the apartments and houses along Calle Norte. Children who hadn't been born when Miguel was arrested played in the small plaza that now occupied the site of his former property, unaware of what had once grown there. The older residents who remembered still sometimes found themselves looking at that plaza and seeing phantom roses, still caught themselves checking their gardens with new wariness, still felt an occasional chill when they saw someone kneeling in soil with that particular intensity that had once characterized Miguel Cortez Miranda. The case became a kind of dark folklore in Azcapotzalco, a story parents told to warn daughters about trusting strangers, a reference point for discussing how evil hides in plain sight. Remember the gardener? People would say when news broke of another predator caught in the neighborhood, and everyone knew exactly which gardener they meant. Miguel's name became synonymous with betrayed trust, with the horrible knowledge that monsters don't always look monstrous. 20 years after his conviction, a journalist requested an interview with Miguel for a retrospective piece on serial killers of the 1980s. Miguel, now in his 70s, agreed to the interview with the single condition that the journalist bring him photographs of gardens. Any gardens, from anywhere. The journalist complied, bringing a folder of images from botanical gardens, private estates, and public parks. Miguel went through the photographs with the careful attention of an art connoisseur, commenting on composition, plant selection, and maintenance quality. He critiqued a Victorian garden for its overwrought formality, and praised a Japanese Zen garden for its understanding of negative space. He seemed genuinely content for the first time in decades, lost in horticultural appreciation. "Do you ever think about the women you killed?" the journalist finally asked. Miguel looked up from a photograph of a rose garden in Guadalajara, his aged face creased with confusion at the question's relevance to their discussion of gardens. "I think about the garden they helped create," he said finally. "Sometimes I dream about it, how beautiful it was. In my dreams, people still come to admire it. They take photographs. They tell me it's the most beautiful garden they've ever seen. And I can tell them thank you. I worked very hard on it. But the women are part of the garden in my dreams. That's the only place they exist now. That's the only place any of us really exist, in memory, in the marks we leave on the world. My marks were beautiful. Most people can't say that." The journalist left the interview feeling physically ill, understanding with renewed horror that no amount of time or imprisonment had created even a glimmer of genuine remorse in Miguel Cortez Miranda. He remained, 2 decades later, the same man who had valued his roses over human lives, who had transformed women into fertilizer without moral hesitation, who had genuinely believed his garden justified his actions. The article, when published, reignited public interest in the case. New photographs of Miguel appeared, now elderly, gray-haired, stooped from age but with eyes that still held that same disturbing disconnect from normal human emotion. The publication prompted renewed calls for harsher sentencing of serial killers and sparked debates about whether someone like Miguel could ever be truly rehabilitated or whether some minds were simply too fundamentally broken to ever be fixed. Maria Luisa, now in her 60s, read the article from the safety of her apartment in a different city, surrounded by her grown children and grandchildren she'd never expected to live long enough to meet. She no longer attended support groups or gave interviews. She had said everything she needed to say about Miguel years ago, but reading about his continued lack of remorse, his persistent fixation on that cursed garden. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Not quite panic, not quite grief, but something combining elements of both. "Are you okay, Mama?" her daughter Carmen asked, noticing the article on her mother's tablet. Maria Luisa looked at her daughter, this woman who had survived her father's shadow and built a good life despite the trauma of her childhood. "I'm okay," she said, and it was mostly true. "I just needed to remind myself that I did the right thing. That speaking up, even when it was terrifying, was the right choice." "You saved our lives," Carmen said simply. "If you hadn't reported him, we would have kept living in that house, sleeping under the same roof as those bodies. We might have become his next victims if he'd ever thought we were a threat." It was true, and Maria Luisa had told herself this many times over the years. But another truth lived alongside it. 7 women had died while she remained silent. Her courage had come too late to save them. She lived with both truths daily, and the weight of them never quite lifted, not completely. Miguel Cortez Miranda died in prison in 2008, at the age of 72, from complications related to diabetes and heart disease. He had served 26 years of his sentence. The prison chaplain who attended him in his final hours reported that Miguel's last coherent words were about seeds. Specifically, heirloom tomato seeds he claimed to have hidden somewhere in his former property. Seeds he wanted recovered and planted so his gardening legacy could continue. "There in a metal tin," he whispered to the chaplain, his voice barely audible. "Behind the 3rd stone in the northwest corner. Someone needs to find them. They're very rare varieties. Please tell someone." The chaplain nodded, though he had no intention of passing along this message. Miguel died minutes later, his final thoughts focused not on redemption or the victims or even his own eternal fate, but on seeds buried in earth that had long since been paved over and converted into a plaza where children played, completely unaware of the horrors that had once bloomed there. His death warranted a small notice in several Mexico City newspapers, reigniting the story one final time. The families of his victims were contacted for comment. Most declined to speak publicly, having long since moved through grief into whatever form of acceptance was possible. Elena Martinez, Rosa's sister, now elderly herself, provided the only substantial statement. "Miguel Cortez Miranda took my sister from this world and tried to erase her existence by turning her into fertilizer for his plants. But Rosa was more than he could ever reduce her to. She was a mother, a sister, a friend. She laughed, she loved, she lived. He took her body, but he couldn't take her memory or the impact she had on people who knew her. That's the difference between us and him. We understand that people are more than just their physical components. He never understood that, and he died never understanding it. I don't forgive him, and I don't mourn him. I'm just grateful he can't hurt anyone else." Miguel's body was cremated without ceremony. His ashes were disposed of according to standard prison protocol, mixed with other unclaimed remains and scattered in an unmarked area far from Mexico City. There would be no grave for people to visit, no marker with his name. The authorities wanted to ensure that Miguel Cortez Miranda would leave no physical trace on the world, no place that could become a shrine or curiosity for those with morbid interests. But erasure was impossible. The case lived on in criminology textbooks, forensic psychology studies, true crime documentaries, and the collective memory of a neighborhood that had learned horror could wear a gardener's stained gloves and smile over a fence while discussing the weather. The house on Calle Norte 87 was gone, the garden destroyed, the killer dead, but the story persisted because it touched something fundamental about human vulnerability and the predators who exploit it. Years after Miguel's death, new residents of Azcapotzalco, who knew the story only as neighborhood legend, would sometimes walk through the plaza that replaced his property and feel an inexplicable unease. The concrete beneath their feet felt wrong somehow, though they couldn't articulate why. Parents would steer their children away from that particular plaza without conscious thought, choosing other parks in the neighborhood for birthday parties and family gatherings. The ground remembered, even if its surface showed no scars. Somewhere beneath the pavement and clean-filled dirt, in soil that had been treated and supposedly purified, the memory of Miguel's garden persisted. Not the garden itself, but the ghost of it, the echo of what had grown there and why. The roses were gone, the victims laid to rest in proper graves with their families, the killer reduced to ash and scattered on the wind. But the story remained, a dark flower that bloomed in the telling and retelling, a reminder that beauty can grow from terrible things, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who convince themselves they're creating something magnificent. Miguel Cortez Miranda wanted to be remembered for his roses. Instead, he's remembered as a cautionary tale about the banality of evil, the danger of dehumanization, and the horrifying truth that some people can commit unspeakable acts without ever recognizing them as evil. Viewing their crimes instead as achievements, their victims as materials, and their garden of bones as a masterpiece that an ungrateful world simply failed to appreciate. The women buried in that garden, Rosa Martinez, Patricia Guzman, Carmen Velasquez, and the 4 others whose names are spoken less often but matter just as much, deserve to be remembered not as Miguel's victims but as people with full lives that were stolen from them. They loved, they worked, they dreamed, they mattered to someone. They were more than the soil they became. They were human beings who deserved to live, and their memory stands as both a memorial and a warning that some monsters garden by daylight, and the most beautiful flowers sometimes grow from the darkest ground. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Schoolgirl Strangler. He smiled at children the way predators smile at prey, with patience, with practice, with perfect, calculated charm. For little girls vanished into thin air, but their killer? He walked among the living for years, hiding behind the face of an ordinary man. We're stalking a ghost tonight, a shadow that moved through the streets of Melbourne like smoke, slipping between the cracks of a city that refused to see him. Arnold Soderman didn't just take lives. He erased them, one small hand at a time, leaving behind nothing but silence and the suffocating weight of questions that would haunt families forever. This is the story of a man who turned childhood innocence into his hunting ground, who wore kindness like a mask while his hands carried the cold grip of death. For times he struck, for times he vanished, and when they finally caught him, the monster didn't roar. He confessed with the calm, chilling indifference of someone discussing the weather. Tonight, we descend into the twisted mind of the schoolgirl strangler, where every smile hid a secret, and every secret buried a child. Evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't wear horns or carry a pitchfork. Sometimes, it walks past you on the street corner, tips its hat, and wishes you a pleasant afternoon. Sometimes, it looks like Arnold Carl Soderman, a man so unremarkable that he could disappear into a crowd without leaving a ripple, without causing a single head to turn. Melbourne, 1930. The city thrummed with the nervous energy of economic depression, where families clutched their pennies tight and children played in dusty streets because there was nowhere else to go. The Great Depression had Australia in its stranglehold, squeezing hope from the working class like water from a stone. People were too busy surviving to notice the quiet man who watched their daughters with eyes that lingered a fraction too long. Soderman was 30 years old, a married man with a job as a laborer. To his neighbors, he was polite, soft-spoken, almost invisible. He had the kind of face you'd forget the moment you looked away. Average height, unremarkable features, the sort of person who could blend into wallpaper. But inside that ordinary skull, something dark had taken root and grown twisted branches that reached toward the most vulnerable prey imaginable: children. His childhood had been a patchwork of cruelty and neglect. Born in 1899 to German immigrant parents, Soderman grew up knowing the sting of his father's belt and the coldness of a mother who seemed incapable of affection. The other children sensed something wrong with him, something off, and they tormented him for it. He was the odd one, the strange boy who didn't quite fit, who spent too much time alone with his thoughts. Those thoughts, even then, were beginning to curdle into something poisonous. As he grew, so did his darkness. He married, played at normalcy, but the facade was paper-thin. His wife would later speak of his violent temper, his sudden mood swings, the way he could transform from calm to savage in the space of a heartbeat. But even she didn't see what was brewing beneath the surface. The hunger that gnawed at him, the compulsion that whispered in his ear like a demon's lullaby. November 1930, Ormond, a quiet suburb where families knew each other's names and children roamed freely because danger was something that happened elsewhere, to other people. 12-year-old Mina Griffiths was one of those children. Bright-eyed, trusting, the kind of girl who would smile at strangers because she'd been taught that the world was fundamentally good. She was walking home from school, her satchel bouncing against her hip, her mind probably on dinner or homework or whatever small concerns occupy the thoughts of a 12-year-old. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere nearby, Arnold Soderman was waiting. The details of their encounter have been reconstructed from Soderman's own confession, delivered years later with the flat, emotionless tone of someone reciting a grocery list. He approached her. He spoke to her. What did he say? What words did this monster use to lure a child into his trap? Perhaps he asked for directions. Perhaps he mentioned knowing her parents. Perhaps he simply smiled that practiced smile and offered to walk her home. However it happened, Mina Griffiths made the fatal mistake of trusting him. She followed him away from the main road, away from safety, away from everything she knew. They walked into a more secluded area, where houses grew sparse and the trees pressed close, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into an eerie twilight. And there, in that isolated place, Soderman's mask finally slipped. The transformation was swift and brutal. His hands, those ordinary, unremarkable hands, wrapped around Mina's throat. She would have fought, of course. Children always fight. They claw and kick and struggle with every ounce of strength their small bodies possess. But what chance does a 12-year-old girl have against a fully grown man consumed by murderous rage? The medical examiner would later note that strangulation is one of the most intimate forms of murder. You feel your victim die. You watch the light leave their eyes. You count each desperate gasp, each weakening struggle. It takes time, longer than people think. 3 to 5 minutes of sustained pressure to render someone unconscious. Longer still to ensure death. Every second of those minutes, Soderman was looking into the face of a child he was murdering. When it was over, when Mina's body went limp and her eyes stared at nothing, Soderman hid her remains in the scrubland. He straightened his clothes, composed himself, and walked back into civilization as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just extinguished a young life. As if he was still human. The search for Mina Griffiths lasted weeks. Her parents distributed flyers with her photograph, her sweet face frozen in time, forever 12. Volunteers combed through bushland, calling her name until their voices went hoarse. The police interviewed neighbors, teachers, anyone who might have seen something, anything. But Soderman was already a ghost, already vanished back into his ordinary life. It wasn't until January 1931 that a farmer stumbled across her body, partially concealed in the scrub. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. This wasn't supposed to happen here, in their safe suburban streets. Monsters belonged in fairy tales, not in Ormond. The police investigation was thorough but ultimately fruitless. They had no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence pointing toward any particular individual. The file on Mina Griffiths went cold, joining the tragic ranks of unsolved murders that haunt every police department's archives. But Soderman wasn't finished. The murder of Mina Griffiths hadn't satisfied whatever darkness drove him. If anything, it had awakened something that demanded to be fed. 18 months later, in June 1931, he struck again. Hazel Wilson was only 6 years old, a tiny, fragile thing who should have had her whole life ahead of her. She disappeared from Inverloch, a coastal town where families vacationed to escape the winter chill of Melbourne. One moment she was there, playing near the beach. The next, she was gone, as if the earth had simply swallowed her whole. Soderman had been there, watching, waiting. He approached the little girl with that practiced charm, that carefully crafted appearance of trustworthiness. What did he tell her? Did he say he'd lost his dog and needed help finding it? Did he offer her candy? Did he claim to know her parents? Whatever lie he spun, it worked. Hazel followed him, her small hand perhaps even trustingly placed in his. Away from the crowds, away from safety, Sodeman's hands found her throat. A 6-year-old child. Her neck would have been so small that his fingers easily encircled it. The terror she must have felt in those final moments, the confusion, the pain, the betrayal of realizing that this friendly man was killing her, is almost unbearable to contemplate. He left her body in bushland near the town. It was discovered quickly this time, but the damage was done. Another family destroyed, another community ripped apart by grief and fear. And still, the police had nothing. No connections between the victims, no witnesses, no leads. Just 2 dead girls and a killer who moved like smoke. The newspapers began to whisper about a monster. Parents pulled their children close and warned them about strangers. The age of innocence was ending, replaced by a creeping paranoia that poisoned the once carefree atmosphere of Australian suburbs. But Sodeman had already melted back into obscurity. He went about his life, working his job, coming home to his wife, maintaining the mask of normalcy. Inside, the hunger was growing. The intervals between his kills were shortening. The darkness was consuming him. January 1935. Nearly 4 years had passed since Hazel Wilson's murder. Perhaps people had started to breathe easier, to believe that whatever monster had stalked their streets had moved on or died. They were wrong. Ethel Belshaw was 12 years old, walking home through Leongatha, a rural town where everyone knew everyone and children were still allowed to walk alone. Sodeman spotted her. The predator in him recognized the opportunity. Once again, he approached. Once again, he deployed his carefully practiced charm. Once again, a child made the fatal mistake of trusting a stranger's smile. The pattern repeated itself with horrifying precision. He led her away from safety. His hands closed around her throat. She struggled. She died. He hid her body in nearby bushland and walked away, leaving behind nothing but another shattered family and a community drowning in fear. 3 dead girls. 3 unsolved murders. The police were desperate, frustrated, aware that they were hunting someone who seemed to be able to strike at will and vanish like a ghost. They had no forensic science to speak of, no DNA testing, no advanced crime scene analysis. They were working with witness statements, physical evidence that degraded quickly, and old-fashioned detective work. Against someone like Sodeman, who left no witnesses and chose his victims carefully, they were nearly helpless. But monsters make mistakes. They grow overconfident. They believe they're invincible. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice finds a way. November 1935. Less than a year after Ethel Belshaw's murder, Sodeman struck for what would be the final time. June Rushmere was only 6 years old, a child so young that she was still learning to navigate the world, still building her understanding of right and wrong, safety and danger. She disappeared from Leongatha, the same town where Ethel had been killed less than a year before. This time, something was different. This time, witnesses came forward. People remembered seeing a man talking to the little girl. They provided descriptions. For the first time, the police had something to work with, a trail, however faint, leading toward the monster who had terrorized Victoria for 5 years. The investigation intensified. Police interviewed residents, followed up on every lead, no matter how small. And slowly, inevitably, the net began to tighten around Arnold Sodeman. The manhunt for June Rushmere's killer consumed Victoria. Newspapers screamed headlines about the schoolgirl strangler, a moniker that captured the public's terror and fascination. Parents locked their doors and watched their children with hawk-like vigilance. The innocence of a generation was being strangled along with these little girls, replaced by suspicion and fear that would linger for decades. Detective Inspector Frederick Piggott was a veteran of the Victoria Police Force, a man who'd seen his share of horrors but nothing quite like this. For young girls, all strangled, all left in bushland like discarded refuse. The cases bore unmistakable similarities. The age of the victims, the method of murder, the careful disposal of bodies in isolated locations. Piggott knew they were hunting a serial killer, even if the term hadn't yet entered common usage. The breakthrough came through painstaking police work. Witnesses who'd seen June Rushmere before her disappearance provided a description of a man who'd been talking to her. Average height, unremarkable appearance, wearing working-class clothes. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had before. Detectives began interviewing men who matched the description, focusing on those with connections to Leongatha and the surrounding areas. The list was long, too long, but among those names, buried in the middle of a seemingly endless roster of suspects, was Arnold Carl Soderman. He'd been working in the area. He had no solid alibi for the time of June's disappearance. And when police knocked on his door to ask him a few routine questions, something in his demeanor triggered alarm bells in the detectives' minds. He was too calm, too composed. Most innocent people confronted by police investigating child murders react with shock, horror, eagerness to help. Soderman displayed none of those emotions. He was blank, neutral, as if the questions about a murdered 6-year-old were no more consequential than inquiries about the weather. They brought him in for further questioning. In the stark, windowless interview room, with its single table and hard chairs, Soderman maintained his composure. He answered questions politely, offering vague responses that neither confirmed nor denied anything substantial. The detectives pushed harder, laying out the evidence they had. His presence in the area, his lack of alibi, witness descriptions that matched his appearance. And then, something extraordinary happened. The mask didn't crack. It simply dissolved, as if it had never existed at all. Soderman looked at Detective Inspector Piggott and, in a voice devoid of emotion, said, "I killed her. I killed them all." The room went silent. Even experienced detectives, men who'd extracted countless confessions, were stunned by the casual way Soderman admitted to murdering 4 children. There was no remorse in his voice, no shame, no horror at what he'd done. He spoke about strangling little girls the way someone might discuss repairing a fence or feeding chickens, as mundane tasks that required no particular emotional investment. "Tell us what happened," Piggott said, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage boiling beneath his professional exterior. And Soderman did. In excruciating detail, he recounted each murder. He described approaching Mina Griffiths in 1930, luring her away from safety and wrapping his hands around her throat. He spoke about the struggle, about how she'd fought him, about the exact moment when her resistance ceased. He told them where he'd hidden her body, as if providing directions to a picnic spot. He moved on to Hazel Wilson, the 6-year-old from Inverloch. "She was very small," he said matter-of-factly. It didn't take long. The detectives in the room had to fight to maintain their composure. They were trained professionals, but listening to a man calmly describe murdering a child tested the limits of their ability to remain objective. Ethel Belshaw, June Rushmere. He confessed to both, providing details that only the killer could have known. The location of bodies, the specific methods he'd used to lure the children, the precise ways he'd hidden their remains. With each revelation, the picture of Arnold Soderman's depravity became clearer and more monstrous. But perhaps most chilling was his explanation for why he'd killed. When asked what drove him to murder children, Soderman paused, as if genuinely considering the question for the first time. Then he said something that would haunt everyone who heard it. "I can't explain it. When I saw them, something came over me. I had to do it. After it was done, I felt better for a while. Then the feeling would come back." He described his compulsion to kill as if it were a physical need, like hunger or thirst. The murders weren't acts of rage or revenge. They weren't motivated by sexual assault, though that was investigators' first assumption. They were, in Soderman's twisted perception, a form of relief. A temporary release from some internal pressure that built within him until it became unbearable. Modern psychologists would recognize this description as consistent with certain types of compulsive serial killers, individuals driven by internal psychological pressures they can neither understand nor control. But in 1935, such concepts were barely developed. To the detectives interrogating Soderman, he was simply a monster beyond comprehension. The confession took hours. Soderman seemed almost relieved to finally talk about what he'd done, as if he'd been carrying a burden that he could finally set down. He showed no emotion when discussing the children's terror, no reaction when confronted with the grief he'd inflicted on their families. He was a void where empathy should have been, a human-shaped absence of humanity. News of the arrest spread through Victoria like wildfire. The schoolgirl strangler had been caught. The monster had a name and a face. Arnold Carl Soderman's photograph appeared in every newspaper. That unremarkable face that had allowed him to move undetected through society for 5 years while murdering children. The public reaction was visceral and immediate. Crowds gathered outside the police station, shouting for Soderman's blood. Death threats poured in. If he'd been released into the streets, there's little doubt he would have been torn apart by an enraged mob. The parents of his victims called for his execution. Editorial writers demanded the harshest possible punishment. Soderman had awakened something primal in the collective consciousness, a demand for justice that bordered on bloodlust. But there was also a darker undercurrent to the public response. Fascination. People wanted to understand how a man could do such things. What created a monster like Arnold Soderman? Was he born evil, or had something in his environment corrupted him? The questions that would fuel decades of criminological study were already being asked, even if the framework to answer them didn't yet exist. Soderman's wife, Eleanor, was devastated. She'd lived with this man, shared his bed, made his meals, and she'd had no idea that he was capable of such horrors. In interviews with police, she described a husband who could be kind one moment and explosively violent the next. She mentioned his unpredictable rages, times when he destroyed furniture or threatened her. But murder, especially the murder of children, she'd never imagined him capable of that. Her testimony revealed a man living a double life, the ordinary laborer who came home for dinner, and the predator who stalked children with cold, calculated precision. How did he maintain that separation? How did he sit across the dinner table from his wife, make small talk about his day, when he'd spent his afternoon strangling a 6-year-old girl? Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate Soderman, trying to determine if he was legally insane. In 1935, the legal standard for insanity was whether the defendant knew right from wrong at the time of the crime. It was a high bar to clear, and Soderman's own statements made it clear that he understood his actions were wrong. He'd hidden the bodies, he'd maintained secrecy, he'd taken deliberate steps to avoid detection. These were not the actions of someone divorced from reality. The psychiatric evaluations revealed a man with what today might be diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder, possibly complicated by other psychological conditions. He demonstrated no empathy, no remorse, no emotional connection to other human beings. He was manipulative, charming when it suited him, and utterly cold when the mask came off. The psychiatrists found him sane by the legal standards of the day, which meant he would stand trial for his crimes. The news that Soderman would face justice in court was met with grim satisfaction. The families of his victims prepared themselves for the ordeal of a trial, knowing they would have to hear the details of their daughter's murders laid out in excruciating detail. They wanted justice, even if it came at the cost of reliving their worst nightmares. But there was another question haunting investigators. Had there been other victims? Soderman had confessed to 4 murders, but his pattern suggested someone who'd possibly killed before. The intervals between murders were long, 18 months between the first and second, nearly 4 years between the second and third. What had he been doing during those gaps? Had there been other victims whose bodies were never found? Other families still searching for missing daughters, unaware that the man responsible was finally behind bars? Detectives reopened cold cases involving missing girls from the areas where Soderman had lived and worked. They found several unsolved disappearances that fit the pattern, but without bodies or evidence, they couldn't definitively link them to Soderman. He claimed 4 victims and only 4. Whether he was telling the truth or simply withholding information about other crimes remains an open question to this day. As the trial date approached, public interest reached a fever pitch. This would be one of the most sensational criminal cases in Australian history. A serial killer who'd murdered children, confessed in chilling detail, and now faced the full weight of justice. The courtroom would be packed. Every word would be reported in newspapers across the country. And at the center of it all would be Arnold Soderman, the unremarkable man who'd become Australia's nightmare. In his cell, awaiting trial, Soderman remained eerily calm. Guards reported that he ate well, slept soundly, and showed no signs of distress. It was as if the weight of his crimes didn't touch him, as if he existed in some psychological space where normal human emotions simply didn't apply. He'd read books, request cigarettes, and occasionally chat with guards about mundane topics, never once mentioning the 4 little girls whose lives he'd stolen. The monster was caged, but the damage he'd inflicted would echo through generations. The families of Mina Griffiths, Hazel Wilson, Ethel Belshaw, and June Rushmere would carry their grief to their graves. The communities he'd terrorized would never fully recover their sense of safety. And Australia would never forget the name Arnold Soderman, the schoolgirl strangler. The trial of Arnold Carl Soderman opened on February 26, 1936, in the Supreme Court of Victoria, Melbourne. The courtroom was a grand space designed to intimidate and impress. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and the scales of justice prominently displayed. But that morning, it felt less like a temple of law and more like a theater where Australia's darkest nightmare would be publicly examined and dissected. Every seat was filled. Members of the press occupied an entire section, their notebooks ready to record every word for the thousands of readers who would devour accounts of the trial. The families of Soderman's victims sat in a reserved area, their faces etched with grief and rage. They'd waited years for this moment, for the man who'd destroyed their lives to face consequences. Arnold Soderman entered the courtroom flanked by guards, his wrists bound in handcuffs. He wore a simple suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression neutral. If he felt any fear or apprehension about the proceedings, it didn't show. He looked almost bored, as if attending his own murder trial was a minor inconvenience rather than a fight for his life. The charges were read aloud, 4 counts of murder. As the judge's voice filled the courtroom, listing the names of the victims, Mina Griffiths, Hazel Wilson, Ethel Belshaw, June Rushmere. Several family members broke down sobbing. Those names represented everything they'd lost. Daughters, sisters, nieces, little girls who'd had their entire lives ahead of them until Arnold Soderman's hands closed around their throats. "How do you plead?" the judge asked. Soderman's lawyer stood. "Guilty, Your Honor. The defendant pleads guilty to all charges." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Guilty pleas in capital cases were unusual. Most defendants fought until the bitter end, clinging to any hope of acquittal or a reduced sentence. But Soderman had chosen not to fight. His confession to police had been complete and detailed. There was no point in denying what he'd done. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Edmund Herron, now had the task of presenting the full horror of Soderman's crimes to the court. Even with a guilty plea, the details needed to be entered into the official record. Justice demanded that the full truth be known. Herron was a formidable figure. Tall, silver-haired, with a voice that could boom across a courtroom or drop to a whisper that forced jurors to lean forward to catch every word. He began by outlining the timeline of Soderman's crimes, establishing the pattern of predation that had terrorized Victoria for 5 years. November 1930, Herron began, his voice grave. 12-year-old Mina Griffiths leaves school, walking the same route she'd walked hundreds of times before. She never makes it home. Her parents report her missing. Volunteers search for weeks, and then her body is found, strangled and hidden in scrubland, discarded like refuse. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. Who could do such a thing? What kind of monster preys on a 12-year-old child? He turned to point at Soderman. That man, that seemingly ordinary man sitting before you. He approached Mina Griffiths. He lured her away from safety with words we'll never know. Lies, certainly promises designed to gain her trust. And then he strangled her. He felt her struggle beneath his hands. He watched her die. And when it was over, he hid her body and went about his life as if nothing had happened. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sounds of weeping from the victims' families. Herron moved on to the second victim. 18 months later, in June 1931, 6-year-old Hazel Wilson vanishes from Inverloch, a tiny child, barely out of infancy, taken from her family forever. Arnold Soderman approached her, gained her trust, and murdered her in exactly the same fashion: strangulation. He left her small body in bushland and once again melted back into society. Heron's presentation was methodical and devastating. He detailed each murder: Ethel Belshaw in January 1935, 12 years old, strangled and left in bushland near Leongatha. And finally, June Rushmere, just 6 years old, murdered in November 1935 in the same town that had lost Ethel less than a year before. For innocent girls, Heron said, his voice rising with controlled fury. For families destroyed. For young lives snuffed out by a man who felt nothing. No remorse, no empathy, no hint of human decency. The defendant has confessed to these crimes. He has provided details that only the killer could know. There is no question of his guilt. The only question before this court is what punishment fits such monstrous crimes. The defense attorney, a man named William Harrod, faced an impossible task. His client had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no reasonable doubt to exploit, no procedural errors to challenge. His only strategy was to argue against the death penalty, to convince the court that despite Soderman's horrific crimes, execution was not the appropriate punishment. Harrod rose to present his case, and the hostility in the courtroom was palpable. How could anyone defend the schoolgirl strangler? What possible argument could be made on behalf of a man who'd murdered for children? Your Honor, Harrod began, my client has committed terrible crimes. No one disputes this. Arnold Soderman has taken the lives of 4 young girls, and nothing can undo that horror. But we must ask ourselves, what purpose does execution serve? Will killing Arnold Soderman bring these girls back? Will it heal the wounds he's inflicted? Or is there another path, one that acknowledges his crimes while also acknowledging that he is, fundamentally, a deeply disturbed individual who requires treatment, not execution? It was a delicate argument, and Harrod knew he was walking a tightrope. He called psychiatric witnesses who testified about Soderman's troubled childhood, his history of head injuries, his explosive temper. They described a man with severe psychological disturbances who might not be fully responsible for his actions. But the prosecution was ready. On cross-examination, Heron systematically demolished the insanity defense. He asked the psychiatrists pointed questions. Did Soderman understand that murder was wrong? Yes. Did he take steps to conceal his crimes? Yes. Did he plan his attacks, choosing vulnerable victims in isolated locations? Yes. Each answer reinforced the same conclusion. Whatever psychological issues Soderman might have had, he was legally sane. He knew right from wrong. He simply chose to do wrong anyway. The most damning testimony came from Soderman himself. Against his lawyer's advice, he insisted on taking the stand. Perhaps he wanted his moment in the spotlight. Perhaps he felt compelled to explain himself. Whatever his motivation, it was a catastrophic decision. Heron approached Soderman with the careful deliberation of a surgeon preparing to make an incision. Mr. Soderman, you've confessed to murdering 4 young girls. Is that correct? Yes, Soderman replied, his voice flat and emotionless. When you approached these children, did you know you intended to kill them? Not always. Sometimes the feeling came over me suddenly. But you knew it was wrong to kill them? Pause. Yes. You knew that taking a child's life would destroy their family? I suppose so. You suppose so? Heron's voice sharpened. Mr. Soderman, did you think about these girls' mothers? Their fathers? Their siblings? Soderman shrugged, as if the question was too trivial to warrant a proper response. The gesture sent a wave of outrage through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery shouted something unintelligible. The judge called for order. Heron pressed on. Why did you kill Mina Griffiths? I don't know. I saw her, and something came over me. Did she scream? Yes. Did she fight you? Yes. Did she beg for her life? Soderman paused, and for the first time, something flickered across his face. Not remorse, but perhaps a memory of those moments. I don't remember. You don't remember if a 12-year-old girl begged you not to kill her? Heron's voice dripped with contempt. It happened a long time ago. The exchange continued, with Heron methodically walking Soderman through each murder. With each answer, Soderman revealed more of his monstrous indifference. He spoke about strangling 6-year-old Hazel Wilson with no more emotion than if he'd been describing swatting a fly. He discussed hiding the bodies as if he'd been disposing of unwanted furniture. The jury watched in horrified fascination. This was evil in its purest form, not the passionate evil of rage or revenge, but the cold, calculating evil of someone who simply didn't care. Soderman wasn't a madman raving about voices in his head. He was a predator who'd chosen to hunt the most vulnerable prey imaginable and felt nothing about it. When Herod tried to rehabilitate his client on redirect examination, it was hopeless. He asked Soderman if he felt remorse now, if he understood the pain he'd caused. "I suppose they're better off where they are," Soderman said, a response so bizarre and tone-deaf that several people in the courtroom gasped. He seemed to be suggesting that the girls he'd murdered were somehow better off dead, a rationalization so twisted that it defied comprehension. The closing arguments were brief. Heron summarized the evidence, emphasizing Soderman's cold-blooded calculation and complete lack of remorse. "This man is a danger to every child in Victoria," he thundered. "He has shown us who he is, a predator without conscience, without humanity. The only appropriate response is the ultimate punishment. The people of Victoria must be protected from Arnold Soderman, and the only way to ensure he never harms another child is to ensure he never draws another breath." Herod made his best effort, pleading for mercy, arguing that life imprisonment would serve justice while avoiding the moral complexity of state-sanctioned execution. But his words fell on deaf ears. The courtroom had already rendered its verdict. The jury was merely a formality. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. The foreman stood. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor. On all 4 counts of murder, we find the defendant guilty." There was no surprise in the courtroom. Soderman had already pled guilty. The verdict was a formality. But the next part would be crucial: sentencing. In 1936 Australia, murder convictions typically resulted in death sentences, though these were often commuted to life imprisonment. The judge would make his decision based on the severity of the crimes, the character of the defendant, and his own conscience. Judge McFarlane looked down at Arnold Soderman with undisguised contempt. "Arnold Carl Soderman, you have been found guilty of 4 counts of murder, the murders of Mina Griffiths, Hazel Wilson, Ethel Belshaw, and June Rushmere. These were not crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated, predatory attacks on innocent children. You have shown no remorse, no recognition of the horror you've inflicted. You are a danger to society, particularly to the most vulnerable members of society, our children." The courtroom held its collective breath. "It is the judgment of this court that you be taken from here to a place of lawful detention, and from there to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none." The death sentence. The spectators erupted in applause. The families of Soderman's victims wept, some from relief, others from the knowledge that even his death wouldn't bring back their daughters. Soderman himself showed no reaction. He simply nodded slightly, as if the judge had just informed him of a schedule change rather than his impending execution. He was led from the courtroom back to his cell, where he would await his date with the gallows. The newspapers would trumpet the verdict in massive headlines. "Schoolgirl strangler sentenced to hang." The public would celebrate, believing that justice had been served. And Arnold Soderman would spend his final days alive, waiting for the moment when the trapdoor would open and the rope would do its work. Pentridge Prison loomed over the suburb of Coburg like a dark monument to human cruelty. Its bluestone walls, 30 feet high and 3 feet thick, had contained some of Victoria's most dangerous criminals since 1851. Now those walls held Arnold Soderman, the schoolgirl strangler, awaiting the execution scheduled for June 1st, 1936. The condemned cells at Pentridge were located in a separate section of the prison, isolated from the general population. The condemned cells at Pentridge were located in a separate section of the prison, isolated from the general population. Soderman occupied a small room, 10 feet by 12 feet, with a narrow cot, a toilet, and a single barred window that offered a slice of sky but no view of freedom. Guards watched him around the clock, documenting his every movement, every word, every expression. The state couldn't risk a suicide that would cheat the gallows. In those final months, Soderman became an object of morbid fascination. Psychiatrists visited regularly, probing his mind, trying to understand what made him tick. Journalists petitioned for interviews, hoping to extract some final revelation that would explain the inexplicable. Religious counselors came to pray for his soul, though Soderman showed little interest in spiritual redemption. The chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, was a veteran of death row ministry. He'd accompanied dozens of condemned men to the gallows, heard their final confessions, offered what comfort he could in those last terrible moments. But Arnold Soderman was unlike anyone he'd encountered before. "He's empty," Father O'Brien confided to the prison warden. "When I look into his eyes, there's nothing there. No fear of death, no remorse for his crimes, no hope for salvation. It's like speaking to a corpse that hasn't quite stopped breathing yet." The warden, a gruff man named Thomas Beck who'd spent 30 years in corrections, had seen his share of killers, but even he found Soderman deeply unsettling. "Most men facing the noose go through stages," Beck explained to his staff. "Denial, rage, bargaining, depression. Soderman just exists. He eats his meals, sleeps soundly, reads his books. Yesterday I asked him if he understood he was going to die, and he looked at me like I'd asked if he knew the sun would rise. Of course he knows. He just doesn't care." This indifference extended to his family. Eleanor Soderman visited once, a visit that left her devastated and convinced she'd married a monster she never truly knew. She sat across from him in the visiting room, separated by a wire mesh, and tried to understand. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you kill those children? What did they ever do to you?" Soderman considered the question with the same bland expression he wore when discussing the weather. "I can't explain it in a way you'd understand. It was something I needed to do." "Needed?" Eleanor's voice rose. "You needed to murder little girls?" "Not wanted. Needed. There's a difference." She left that day and never returned. She would later change her name, move to another state, and spend the rest of her life trying to forget she'd ever been married to the schoolgirl strangler. In interviews years later, she would describe feeling like she'd lived with a ghost, something that looked human but lacked whatever essential quality makes us human. As Soderman's execution date approached, the debate over capital punishment intensified across Australia. Some argued that monsters like Soderman proved the necessity of the death penalty, that some crimes were so heinous, some criminals so dangerous, that execution was the only appropriate response. Others countered that state-sanctioned killing reduced society to the murderer's level, that life imprisonment would serve justice without the moral stain of institutional killing. The families of Soderman's victims were divided. Mina Griffith's father publicly stated that watching Soderman hang would provide no comfort, no closure. "It won't bring my daughter back," he told reporters, his face haggard with grief that had aged him a decade in 5 years. "But I also can't bear the thought of him living while she's dead. I don't know what I want anymore, except for this nightmare to end." Hazel Wilson's mother took a different stance. She wanted Soderman dead, and she wanted to witness his execution. When prison authorities informed her that witnesses to hangings were strictly limited to officials and the condemned's family, she wrote letters to every government official she could think of, begging for the chance to watch the man who'd murdered her 6-year-old daughter die. Her request was denied, but her anguish reflected a sentiment shared by many. Soderman had opened wounds in the collective psyche that couldn't heal, while he still drew breath. His execution became a focal point for all the rage and grief and helplessness that his crimes had generated. The newspapers counted down to the execution date with ghoulish enthusiasm. They printed detailed descriptions of the gallows at Pentridge, explaining the mechanics of judicial hanging. They interviewed former executioners who described the process: the walk to the scaffold, the placing of the hood, the adjustment of the noose, the final drop. Circulation soared as readers devoured every morbid detail. Inside his cell, Soderman seemed oblivious to the frenzy surrounding him. He read detective novels, a choice of reading material that struck many as grotesquely ironic. He ate well, better than he had as a free man, perhaps. The condemned were afforded special meals, a small mercy before the ultimate punishment. Soderman requested steak and eggs for breakfast, roast beef for dinner, and complained when the potatoes weren't cooked to his liking. His casual comfort infuriated the guards. They'd seen men go mad in the condemned cells, screaming through the night, banging their heads against the walls until blood streaked the stone. They'd watched religious conversions born of terror, witnessed hard men reduced to weeping children as their execution dates approached. Soderman's calm felt like a mockery of justice itself. "It's not human," one guard muttered to another during a shift change. "To kill 4 little girls and then sleep like a baby every night? That's not a man. That's something else wearing a man's skin." Dr. Leonard Hayes, one of the psychiatrists evaluating Soderman, attempted to conduct a final comprehensive assessment. He spent hours with Soderman in the weeks before execution, probing for some insight into his psychology. The resulting report would become a foundational document in the study of serial killers, though the term itself wouldn't be coined for decades. Hayes documented Soderman's complete lack of empathy, his inability to form genuine emotional connections, his view of other humans as objects rather than people. He noted Soderman's childhood trauma, the abuse, the isolation, the early signs of violent tendencies. But Hayes also acknowledged the limitations of his understanding. "There is something in this man that defies classification," he wrote. "He is not insane by legal standards. He understands morality intellectually but seems incapable of feeling its weight. It is as if he is missing some fundamental component that makes us human." In their final session, Hayes asked Soderman if he had any regrets. Soderman thought for a moment. "I regret getting caught," he said. "Beyond that, no. Not the murders themselves, not the families you destroyed. I can't regret what I had to do. You didn't have to kill those girls." Soderman looked at Hayes with something approaching pity, as if the psychiatrist was the one who didn't understand. "You think you have control over everything you do. You don't. There are things inside us that make demands." I answered mine. It was the closest Soderman ever came to explaining himself, and it explained nothing at all. Hayes left the session feeling contaminated, as if exposure to Soderman's worldview had tainted something essential in his own psyche. May 31st, 1936, the day before the execution, Soderman was moved to the death cell adjacent to the gallows room. The proximity was deliberate. Condemned prisoners spent their final night able to hear workmen testing the trapdoor, checking the rope, ensuring everything would function smoothly. The psychological torture of those sounds was considered part of the punishment. But if Soderman heard the testing of the gallows that would kill him, he gave no sign. He ate his final dinner: roast chicken, vegetables, bread pudding for dessert, and pronounced it satisfactory. Father O'Brien made one last attempt to save his soul. "Arnold, tomorrow morning you will stand before God and account for your sins. The murders of those children will weigh on your soul for eternity unless you truly repent. Please, for the sake of your immortal soul, ask for forgiveness." Soderman regarded the priest with mild interest. If there is a God, and if those girls are with him, then they're fine. If there's nothing after death, then they feel nothing. Either way, they're beyond suffering. My conscience is clear. Your conscience is clear? Father O'Brien's composure cracked. You murdered 4 innocent children, and your conscience is clear? They were going to die eventually anyway. Everyone does. I just moved up the timeline. The priest left the cell shaking, his faith in humanity severely tested. He would tell the warden later that he'd prayed for Arnold Soderman's soul, but for the first time in his ministry, he'd truly doubted whether some souls could be saved. Soderman spent his final night reading. When guards checked on him at midnight, he was calmly turning pages of a Western novel. At 2 a.m., he was asleep. At 5 a.m., He woke naturally, as if it were any other morning, and requested his breakfast: eggs, toast, strong black coffee. June 1st, 1936. Execution Day. The morning dawned gray and cold, appropriate weather for what was to come. Inside Pentridge, the machinery of judicial death moved with practiced efficiency. The hangman, a man named Samuel Hawkins who'd performed dozens of executions, arrived early to make final preparations. He checked the rope, 13 coils, properly treated to prevent slipping. He verified the trap-door mechanism. He calculated the drop length based on Soderman's weight, 172 pounds, to ensure instant death rather than slow strangulation. At 7:45 a.m., Warden Beck entered Soderman's cell. "It's time," he said simply. Soderman stood, stretched, and buttoned his shirt. "Let's get on with it then." The procession to the gallows was brief, perhaps 20 feet from the death cell to the execution chamber. Soderman walked steadily, flanked by guards, with Father O'Brien reciting prayers that fell on deaf ears. The gallows room was stark and functional: the wooden platform, the dangling noose, the lever that would open the trapdoor. A small group of witnesses had assembled as required by law: prison officials, a doctor to pronounce death, a magistrate to verify the execution was carried out according to law. Their faces were grim, reflecting the terrible duty they were about to witness. Soderman mounted the scaffold steps without assistance. Hawkins positioned him over the trapdoor with professional precision. As he began to secure Soderman's legs, binding them so he wouldn't thrash during the drop, Warden Beck performed his final duty. "Arnold Carl Soderman, you have been sentenced to death by hanging for the murders of Mina Griffiths, Hazel Wilson, Ethel Belshaw, and June Rushmere. Do you have any final words?" Soderman looked out at the witnesses, his expression unchanged. For a moment, it seemed he might say nothing. Then he spoke, his voice clear and steady. "I did what I did. You're doing what you do. We're all just animals in the end." Those words, cold, nihilistic, utterly devoid of remorse, would be his epitaph. Father O'Brien began the Lord's Prayer, his voice wavering. Hawkins placed the white hood over Soderman's head, concealing his face. He adjusted the noose, positioning the knot carefully behind Soderman's left ear for a clean break. The seconds stretched into eternity. Hawkins stepped back and nodded to the executioner's assistant, who gripped the lever. Father O'Brien's voice continued, "And forgive us our trespasses." The lever was pulled. The trapdoor dropped with a thunderous bang that echoed through the chamber. Arnold Soderman fell through the opening, the rope snapping taut with brutal finality. His neck broke instantly, a clean execution, if such a thing can be said to exist. His body swung gently for a moment, then went still. The doctor approached, waited the required duration, then checked for a pulse. "Pronounced dead at 8:03 a.m., June 1st, 1936, he announced formally. It was over. The schoolgirl strangler was dead. The monster that had terrorized Victoria for 5 years had drawn his last breath. Justice, cold and final, had been served. But in the silence that followed, as the witnesses filed out and Soderman's body was cut down to be buried in an unmarked grave within the prison walls, a question lingered. Had his death accomplished anything? The 4 girls he'd murdered were still dead. Their families' grief remained as raw as ever. The scars on Victoria's collective psyche would take generations to fade. Arnold Soderman's execution wouldn't resurrect his victims or erase the trauma he'd inflicted. It was simply an ending, necessary perhaps, but hollow in its finality. The newspapers would trumpet justice served. The public would move on to other scandals, other horrors. But the families of Mina, Hazel, Ethel, and June would carry their loss until their own deaths. In the decades since, the Soderman case has become a touchstone for discussions about evil, mental illness, and the nature of serial killers. Criminologists study his patterns. Psychologists debate what created him. True crime enthusiasts obsess over the details of his crimes. But beneath all the analysis and theorizing, the simple truth remains. Arnold Soderman was a man who chose to murder children and felt nothing about it. He walked among us wearing the mask of normalcy, and when that mask finally came off, we saw something that chilled us to our bones. Not a raving lunatic, but a void where humanity should have been. His story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks past you on the street, tips its hat, and wishes you a good day. Sometimes it looks absolutely ordinary. And sometimes the monsters we fear are the ones who look most like us until they don't. The gallows at Pentridge Prison stood for years after Soderman's execution, claiming other lives before capital punishment was finally abolished in Victoria in 1975. The prison itself closed in 1997 and has since been converted to residential apartments. People live now where condemned men once spent their final nights, where the trapdoor once dropped, where Arnold Soderman breathed his last. But the memory persists. The schoolgirl strangler remains part of Australia's dark history, a cautionary tale about the evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary faces. His crimes shocked a nation and changed how Australians viewed their own safety. After Soderman, parents held their children tighter. Communities looked at strangers with new suspicion. The age of innocence ended, replaced by a wariness that persists to this day. For little girls, Mina, Hazel, Ethel, and June deserve to grow up, to experience love and heartbreak, to chase their dreams, to live full lives. Instead, they became names in a case file, victims of a predator who saw them as nothing more than objects for his compulsion. Their stolen futures haunt us still, reminding us of the precious fragility of innocence and the terrible capacity for evil that exists within the human heart. Arnold Soderman died on the gallows in 1936, but his shadow stretches across the decades. He showed us something we didn't want to see, that monsters are real, that they walk among us, and that sometimes the only face evil wears is the face of an ordinary man. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Truro Murderers, Christopher Worrell and James Miller story. Some killers hunt alone. Others find a partner who makes them unstoppable. In the scorched hills of South Australia, 2 men turned a friendship into a death pact, and 7 young women paid the price. When a charming young man with epilepsy asked for help on a quiet highway, girls didn't hesitate to get into his van. They couldn't see the second man waiting in the shadows. They couldn't know that their kindness would be their execution. Tonight, we descend into the nightmare of Christopher Worrell and James Miller, the Truro murderers, a pair whose twisted bond transformed the sunburned roads of Adelaide into hunting grounds. This is the story of predators who wore human masks, of bodies buried in shallow graves beneath the Australian sky, and of a friendship forged in the darkest corners of human depravity. 7 women vanished, 7 families shattered, and when the truth finally crawled into the light, it revealed something more terrifying than anyone imagined: that evil doesn't always work alone. Christopher Robin Worrell was born into ordinariness on February 19, 1954, in Adelaide, South Australia. His childhood unfolded like 1,000 others in the working-class suburbs, unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of youth that dissolves into memory without leaving a trace. But inside that ordinary boy, something dark was gestating, something that would eventually claw its way to the surface and leave a trail of bodies in its wake. He was handsome, devastatingly so, with blue eyes that sparkled with mischief and a smile that could disarm suspicion. Christopher possessed the kind of magnetism that drew people in like moths to a killing flame. Girls found him irresistible. Friends found him exciting. Nobody found him dangerous. That was his greatest weapon. At 18, Christopher met Deborah Scoos, a young woman who saw in him the promise of adventure and romance. They fell into a relationship quickly, the kind of intense coupling that happens when youth and passion collide. But Deborah would soon learn that the charming boy she'd fallen for harbored appetites that went far beyond normal desire. Christopher suffered from epilepsy, a condition that required regular medication and occasional hospital visits. He wore this vulnerability like a costume, using it to cultivate sympathy, to appear harmless, to create an image of a young man struggling bravely against a medical condition beyond his control. People wanted to help him. Women especially wanted to comfort him. He knew this. He exploited it with surgical precision. By 1976, Christopher had acquired a van, a vehicle that would become his mobile hunting blind, his trap, his chamber of horrors on wheels. He customized it carefully, removing the back seats, installing thick curtains over the windows, creating a space where screams would be muffled and struggles would be invisible to the outside world. The van became an extension of his predatory instinct, a tool perfectly designed for the dark work he had in mind. But Christopher didn't hunt alone. James William Miller entered Christopher's life like a shadow finding its body. Born on December 30th, 1940, James was 14 years older than Christopher, a man whose own darkness had been simmering for decades. Where Christopher was charming and magnetic, James was withdrawn and calculating. Where Christopher drew victims in with his smile, James was content to lurk in the background, watching, waiting, participating in the violence with cold detachment. The two men met through the Adelaide social scene, crossing paths at parties and gatherings where cheap alcohol flowed and inhibitions dissolved. They recognized something in each other, a shared hollowness, a mutual appetite for cruelty, a compatibility of evil that most people would never understand. Their friendship wasn't built on shared interests or common hobbies. It was built on a shared hunger for domination, for violence, for the intoxicating power that comes from taking another person's life. James moved in with Christopher and Deborah in late 1976, an arrangement that seemed innocent on the surface but that would prove to be the catalyst for horror. Deborah didn't like James. She found him strange, unsettling, the kind of person whose presence made a room feel smaller and darker. She couldn't articulate exactly what bothered her about him, but her instincts screamed warnings that she couldn't quite hear over the noise of her devotion to Christopher. The dynamic between the three of them grew increasingly toxic. Christopher and James would disappear together for hours, sometimes days, offering vague explanations about where they'd been and what they'd been doing. Deborah sensed that something was wrong, that the man she loved was involved in something terrible, but she couldn't bring herself to confront the full horror of what was happening. On December 23, 1976, just 2 days before Christmas, 18-year-old Veronica Knight was hitchhiking in Adelaide when a van pulled up beside her. Inside was a handsome young man with a friendly smile and kind eyes. Christopher offered her a ride. Veronica accepted. She climbed into the van, pulled the door shut behind her, and in that single moment, sealed her fate. James was already inside, hidden behind the curtain that separated the front of the van from the back. As Christopher drove away from the populated streets and toward the isolated roads that snaked through the Adelaide hills, James emerged from his hiding place. Veronica's confusion turned to fear, then to terror as she realized she'd been trapped. What happened to Veronica Knight in that van remains known only to her killers. The details of her final hours were never fully disclosed, but the evidence later recovered painted a picture of unimaginable suffering. She was sexually assaulted. She was tortured. She was murdered with a savagery that spoke to the depth of Christopher and James's depravity. They drove her body to Truro, a small town northeast of Adelaide, surrounded by bushland and scrub that stretched for miles in every direction. The terrain was perfect for their purposes, remote, desolate, rarely traveled. They buried Veronica in a shallow grave, covering her with dirt and branches, leaving her to rot beneath the Australian sun, while they drove back to Adelaide to celebrate Christmas as if nothing had happened. Veronica's family reported her missing. Police began an investigation, but Veronica had vanished completely, leaving behind no trace, no evidence, no indication of what had happened to her. She became another missing person in a world full of people who disappear without explanation. Christopher and James had tasted blood. They had discovered that they could kill and get away with it. They had learned that the world was full of vulnerable young women, that society had created perfect victims. Hitchhikers, runaways, girls who traveled alone and trusted too easily. They had found their hunting ground, their burial site, their method of operation. They would kill again, and again, and again. Throughout January 1977, Christopher continued his normal life. He went to work. He came home to Deborah. He maintained his relationships with friends and family. He presented himself as a regular young man dealing with the challenges of epilepsy and trying to build a future. Nobody suspected that he and James were actively hunting for their next victim. James remained in the shadows, the silent partner in their murderous enterprise. He was the planner, the one who thought through logistics and details, while Christopher provided the charm and charisma needed to lure victims. Together, they formed a killing machine more effective than either could have been alone. Deborah's unease grew. Christopher's behavior was changing in subtle ways. He was more secretive, more aggressive, more sexually demanding. He would disappear with James and return with scratches on his arms and dirt under his fingernails. When she asked questions, he would deflect with jokes or affection or sudden anger that made her afraid to push further. She didn't know about Veronica Knight. She didn't know about the shallow grave in Truro. She didn't know that the man she loved had crossed a line from which there could be no return. But she would learn. Eventually, the truth would force its way into the light, dragging with it the full horror of what Christopher Robin Worrell and James William Miller had become. The monster had tasted blood. The monster wanted more. And the quiet roads of South Australia were about to run red with the consequences of two men's decision to turn their darkest fantasies into reality. January 1977 arrived with the oppressive heat that characterizes Australian summers. The sun beat down mercilessly on Adelaide, turning roads into shimmering mirages and driving people to seek relief wherever they could find it. Young women in light dresses stood by roadsides, thumbs extended, hoping for rides to beaches, to friends' houses, to anywhere that offered escape from the suffocating temperatures. Christopher Worrell and James Miller prowled these roads like sharks circling wounded prey. They had refined their technique with Veronica Knight's murder, learning what worked and what needed improvement. The van had proven effective. Christopher's charm had been the perfect lure. The isolation of Truro had provided the perfect disposal site. All they needed now was to perfect their timing and selection of victims. On January 12, 1977, 15-year-old Tanya Kenny was hitchhiking near her home in the Adelaide suburb of Ferryden Park. She was small, vulnerable, trusting in the way that teenagers often are before the world teaches them fear. When Christopher's van pulled up beside her and he offered her a ride with that devastating smile, she didn't hesitate. James was waiting in the back. Tanya's abduction followed the same pattern as Veronica's. Once she was inside the van and they had driven away from populated areas, James revealed himself. The terror in Tanya's eyes as she realized her mistake must have been intoxicating to them. That moment when a victim understands that death is approaching and there is nothing they can do to stop it. They drove her into the hills, away from civilization, away from help, away from any possibility of rescue. What they did to Tanya Kenny in those final hours demonstrated an escalation in their violence. They weren't just killing anymore. They were experimenting, exploring the boundaries of their own cruelty, discovering what they were capable of when all moral restraints had been removed. Tanya's body joined Veronica's in the burial grounds at Truro. The shallow graves were close together, creating a grotesque cemetery of innocents destroyed. Christopher and James covered her with dirt and brush, then drove back to Adelaide, already planning their next hunt. The disappearances were beginning to form a pattern that would eventually draw police attention. But in early 1977, the connections hadn't yet been made. Missing persons cases were common. Young women often ran away from home, moved to other cities, started new lives without telling their families. The police investigated, but without bodies or evidence, there was little they could do except file reports and hope the missing would eventually be found. Christopher's epilepsy medication was running low. He needed a refill, which meant a trip to the hospital for a checkup and prescription renewal. These visits were routine for him, part of the normal rhythm of his life. But on one of these visits, something happened that would eventually prove catastrophic for him and James. A young nurse noticed Christopher. He was charming as always, flirting with the medical staff, making jokes about his condition, playing the role of the brave young man dealing with a difficult diagnosis. The nurse responded to his attention, drawn in by his magnetism. They exchanged phone numbers. Christopher added her to his mental catalog of potential victims. But James was growing bolder, more demanding. The partnership between them was shifting, with James pushing for more frequent kills, more elaborate violence, more risk-taking. Christopher, despite being the more charismatic of the two, was beginning to realize that he'd created a monster he couldn't fully control. On February 7, 1977, 18-year-old Juliet Maikaida was walking to her boyfriend's house in Adelaide's northern suburbs. She was pretty, with dark hair and a bright smile, excited about her evening plans. When a van slowed beside her and the driver offered her a ride, she accepted, perhaps thinking it would save her a long walk in the heat. Christopher and James were becoming more efficient with each kill. They knew now how to subdue victims quickly, how to minimize noise, how to avoid leaving evidence in the van. Juliet Maikaida didn't have time to scream before they had her under control. Her murder was particularly brutal. The autopsy would later reveal injuries that spoke to prolonged torture, to sexual assault of the most vicious kind, to a death that came only after hours of unimaginable suffering. Christopher and James were no longer satisfied with quick kills. They wanted to savor the experience, to stretch out the violence, to fully indulge the darkness that had consumed them both. Juliet's body was buried near the others at Truro. The cemetery of horrors was growing, each shallow grave containing not just a body but the shattered dreams of a young woman whose life had been violently ended before it had truly begun. 3 murders in less than 2 months. Christopher and James were in the grip of a feeding frenzy, a killing spree that showed no signs of slowing. They were addicted to the power, to the violence, to the godlike feeling of holding life and death in their hands. But their success was also making them reckless. Deborah Scoos could no longer ignore what was happening. Christopher's behavior had become increasingly erratic and frightening. He would have violent nightmares, waking up screaming. He became sexually aggressive in ways that terrified her. His explanations for his whereabouts grew more elaborate and less believable. And James had become a permanent, oppressive presence in their home. He and Christopher would have whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. They would leave together at odd hours and return covered in dirt and sweat. The van, once just a vehicle, now seemed to emanate a darkness that Deborah could feel even when she was nowhere near it. On March 21, 1977, 22-year-old Sylvia Pittman disappeared while hitchhiking near the Adelaide suburb of Alberton. She was mature, cautious, the kind of woman who normally wouldn't take unnecessary risks. But something about Christopher Worrell must have seemed safe to her. Perhaps it was his smile. Perhaps it was his apparent medical vulnerability. Perhaps it was simply bad luck, being in the wrong place at the wrong time when a predator was hunting. Sylvia became the 4th victim to be buried at Truro. Her death followed the same horrific pattern as the others: abduction, assault, torture, murder, disposal. Christopher and James had developed a routine, a system that worked efficiently to satisfy their depraved appetites. April brought Vicky Howell into their orbit. The 26-year-old woman disappeared on April 15, 1977, after accepting a ride from a man in a van. She was older than the previous victims, more worldly, but age and experience offered no protection against the calculated evil of Christopher Worrell and James Miller. Vicky's murder marked a subtle shift in their pattern. They were becoming bolder about who they targeted, less concerned about selecting only young, vulnerable girls. Any woman alone was now potential prey. The boundaries of their hunting grounds were expanding. The frequency of their kills was increasing. Connie Iordanides was 26 years old when she vanished on April 22, 1977, just 1 week after Vicky Howell. She had been hitchhiking, that fatal decision that so many young women made in an era when hitchhiking was still considered relatively safe. Christopher's van appeared beside her like an answer to a prayer. Instead, it delivered her into hell. 6 murders in 4 months. The bodies at Truro were accumulating, creating a grotesque monument to Christopher and James's depravity. But the police still hadn't connected the disappearances. Each case was being investigated separately, and without bodies, there was no evidence to suggest a serial killer was operating in Adelaide. Christopher and James grew confident. They believed themselves untouchable, too clever to be caught, too careful to leave evidence. But they were wrong. Their final victim would be the one that ultimately unraveled everything. 23-year-old Deborah Lamb had her whole life ahead of her when she encountered Christopher Worrell on May 23, 1977. What she couldn't know was that she was about to become the seventh and final name on a list of victims, the last young woman to die at the hands of two men who had turned murder into a shared hobby. Deborah's body joined the others at Truro, buried in the same shallow manner, covered with the same inadequate concealment. But something was different this time. Perhaps Christopher and James were growing tired. Perhaps they were becoming sloppy from overconfidence. Perhaps fate was finally preparing to deliver justice, because Christopher Worrell's epilepsy was about to save him from justice in the most unexpected way possible, by killing him before he could face trial for his crimes. And when he died, he would take secrets with him that would haunt James William Miller for the rest of his life. The feeding frenzy was over. The reckoning was about to begin. February 19, 1977, Christopher Robin Worrell's 23rd birthday. He celebrated surrounded by friends and family, playing the role of the charming young man grateful for another year of life despite his medical challenges. Nobody looking at him that day could have imagined that he had already murdered 4 young women and buried them in shallow graves in the scrubland around Truro. The duality of his existence was remarkable. By day, he was Christopher the boyfriend, Christopher the friend, Christopher the epileptic struggling bravely with his condition. By night, he was something else entirely. A predator who used his medical vulnerability as a weapon. A killer who had found in James Miller a partner who shared and amplified his darkest impulses. But the partnership was beginning to strain under its own weight. James was pushing for more frequent kills, more elaborate torture, more risk-taking. Christopher, despite his own capacity for evil, was beginning to feel the psychological toll of their crimes. He was having nightmares where the faces of his victims appeared before him, their eyes accusing, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Deborah Scoos had reached her breaking point. She couldn't continue living with the growing certainty that something terrible was happening, that the man she loved was involved in something monstrous. She confronted Christopher multiple times, demanding to know what he and James were doing during their disappearances, why he came home with dirt under his fingernails and scratches on his arms, why the van now smelled of chemicals and had suspicious stains on the carpet. Christopher's responses alternated between charm and rage. He would tell her she was being paranoid, that she was inventing problems where none existed. Then he would suddenly explode in anger, screaming at her to mind her own business, threatening her with violence if she continued to ask questions. These emotional swings terrified Deborah more than any direct admission could have. By mid-1977, after Deborah Lamb's murder in May, Christopher's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He was drinking more heavily, taking his epilepsy medication irregularly, engaging in arguments with James that sometimes escalated to physical violence. The bond between the two killers was fraying, stress fractures appearing in their partnership. Then, on August 27, 1977, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Christopher was driving his van through the Adelaide Hills when he suffered a massive epileptic seizure. The van swerved violently off the road, careening down an embankment and crashing into a tree with devastating force. The impact was catastrophic. Christopher was rushed to hospital with severe injuries. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize him, but the damage was too extensive. His skull had been fractured. His brain had swelled. Internal bleeding was massive and uncontrollable. On February 19, 1977, Christopher Robin Worrell had celebrated his 23rd birthday as a free man and an active serial killer. Less than 6 months later, he lay dying in a hospital bed, his secrets dying with him. He lingered for several days in a coma, surrounded by medical equipment and the quiet beeping of monitors. Deborah sat by his bedside, holding his hand, crying for the man she had loved before he became a monster. If such a man had ever truly existed. James Miller came to visit once, standing in the doorway, staring at his partner's broken body with an expression that nurses later described as unreadable. Christopher Robin Worrell died on September 19, 1977, exactly 1 month after the accident. He was 23 years old. The official cause of death was complications from injuries sustained in the vehicle accident. Nobody suspected that a serial killer had just escaped justice through death. For James Miller, Christopher's death was catastrophic. He had lost his partner in crime, the charming front man who lured victims into their trap. More importantly, he had lost the one person who shared his terrible secrets, who understood the depths of his depravity, who could never testify against him because they were equally guilty. But James had also lost his protection, because Christopher's death would eventually lead to an investigation that would uncover everything. Deborah Scoos, freed from Christopher's controlling presence and emotional manipulation, began to process what she had suspected throughout their relationship. Memories that she had suppressed came flooding back. The disappearances, the dirt and blood, the whispered conversations, the changes in Christopher's behavior that coincided with news reports of missing women. She went to the police. At first, investigators were skeptical. A grieving girlfriend making vague accusations against a dead man and his friends seemed like a thin foundation for an investigation. But Deborah was persistent. She provided details: the van, the trips to Truro, James Miller's presence, the timeline of Christopher's behavioral changes. Detective Stan Swain was assigned to investigate Deborah's claims. He was a methodical investigator, the kind of man who followed evidence wherever it led, no matter how disturbing the destination. He began by interviewing James Miller. James initially presented himself as a grieving friend devastated by Christopher's death. He denied any knowledge of criminal activity. He claimed that he and Christopher had been close friends who occasionally went camping in the bush. Nothing more. But Stan Swain sensed deception in James's carefully constructed answers. The detective began pulling at threads, examining Christopher's movements in the months before his death, looking for connections between his activities and the missing women. The pattern began to emerge. Disappearances clustered around times when Christopher had taken his van into the Adelaide Hills. Witness reports of a van matching the description of Christopher's vehicle seen near locations where women had last been spotted. In January 1978, for months after Christopher's death, Stan Swain made the decision to search the areas around Truro that Deborah had mentioned. He organized a search party of police officers and volunteers, dividing the vast bushland into grids, systematically combing through miles of scrub and dirt. On January 21, 1978, a police officer's shovel struck something soft beneath the earth. The excavation began carefully, revealing fabric, then flesh, then the unmistakable shape of a human body. It was Veronica Knight, or what remained of her after 13 months in a shallow grave. The discovery triggered an intensive search. Within days, police had uncovered 6 more bodies: Tanya Kenny, Juliet Maikaida, Sylvia Pittman, Vicky Howell, Connie Iordanides, and Deborah Lamb. All 7 victims were found in the same general area, all buried in shallow graves, all showing evidence of sexual assault and extreme violence before death. South Australia was horrified. 7 young women, all murdered, all disposed of like garbage in the scrubland. The media descended on Truro, transforming the quiet rural area into a symbol of horror. The question everyone wanted answered was simple: who had done this? Christopher Worrell was dead, beyond the reach of justice. But James William Miller was still alive, and every piece of evidence pointed directly at his involvement in the murders. On February 15, 1978, police arrested James Miller and charged him with 7 counts of murder. He denied everything, claiming that he had known nothing about Christopher's activities, that he had been an innocent friend unaware of the monster living in his presence. But the evidence was overwhelming. Fibers from the van matched fibers found on the victim's clothing. Witness statements placed James with Christopher on dates and times corresponding to several of the disappearances. Most damning of all was Deborah Scoos' testimony about the relationship between Christopher and James, the trips they took together, the secrets they shared. James's defense team tried to argue that all the murders had been committed by Christopher alone, that James had been an unwitting accomplice at most. They painted Christopher as the dominant personality, the charming psychopath who had manipulated everyone around him, including James. But prosecutors presented a different narrative. one of two killers working in partnership, each enabling and encouraging the other's worst impulses. Christopher had provided the charm and the charisma to lure victims. James had provided the planning and the willingness to engage in extreme violence. Together, they had created a killing machine more effective than either could have been alone. The trial began on August 21, 1979, nearly 2 years after Christopher's death. It would become one of the most sensational criminal trials in Australian history, revealing in excruciating detail the depravity of the Truro murders and forcing the nation to confront the reality of serial killers operating in their midst. James William Miller sat in the defendant's chair, his face impassive, refusing to show emotion as witness after witness testified about the horror he had helped create. The evidence piled up, each piece adding another layer to the prosecution's case. Each testimony painting a picture of a man who had participated enthusiastically in the torture and murder of 7 innocent women. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. Guilty on all 7 counts of murder. James Miller was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. At sentencing, the judge spoke words that would echo through Australian criminal history. These were crimes of unimaginable cruelty, committed without remorse, representing a depravity that society cannot and will not tolerate. James Miller was led away to begin his life sentence, disappearing into the prison system where he would remain for decades, forgotten by most, remembered only by the families of his victims and those who studied the darkest corners of human nature. But the story didn't end with James's conviction, because the Truro murders had exposed uncomfortable truths about Australian society in the 1970s, about the vulnerability of young women, about the dangers of hitchhiking, about the monsters that could hide behind charming smiles and friendly offers of help. The unraveling had revealed the full horror of Christopher Worrell and James Miller's crimes. But it had also revealed something more disturbing, that such evil could exist anywhere, could wear any face, could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. The 7 young women buried in Truro had learned this truth too late. Their families would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. The conviction of James William Miller should have brought closure. The monster was caged. Justice had been served. The families of the 7 victims could begin the impossible process of healing. But true crime rarely offers clean endings, and the Truro murders left behind questions that would haunt investigators, psychologists, and the families of the victims for decades. Who were Christopher Robin Worrell and James William Miller, really? How did 2 men from relatively ordinary backgrounds transform into serial killers capable of such extreme depravity? What created the chemistry between them that turned individual darkness into collaborative horror? Psychologists who studied the case after James's conviction identified several key factors that contributed to the partnership's lethal effectiveness. Christopher possessed traits consistent with psychopathy: superficial charm, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, grandiosity, and a need for stimulation. He was the kind of person who could compartmentalize his life completely, maintaining his public persona as a friendly young man while privately indulging in torture and murder. James Miller presented a different psychological profile. He was withdrawn, socially awkward, lacking the charisma that made Christopher so dangerous. But he possessed something equally terrifying: a complete absence of moral restraint once he found a partner who validated his darkest impulses. In psychological terms, James was a compliant killer, one who needed the presence and encouragement of a dominant partner to act on homicidal urges. Together, they formed what criminologists call a killing team, a partnership where each member's strengths compensated for the other's weaknesses, creating a combined threat greater than the sum of its parts. Christopher provided the ability to lure victims. James provided the willingness to engage in extreme violence without hesitation. The combination was lethal, but the psychological analysis couldn't answer the question that haunted everyone who studied the case. Could these murders have been prevented? Warning signs had been present throughout Christopher's life. He had demonstrated cruelty to animals as a child, a classic predictor of future violence. He had been unusually sexually aggressive with teenage girlfriends, pushing boundaries in ways that made some women uncomfortable. His epilepsy medication often went untaken, suggesting a general disregard for rules and consequences. James Miller's background was equally concerning in retrospect. He had been a loner throughout his life, struggling to form normal social connections, expressing views about women that suggested deep-seated misogyny and resentment. Several people who knew him before the murders described feeling uneasy around him, sensing something wrong beneath his quiet exterior. Yet none of these warning signs had been sufficient to trigger intervention. Both men had moved through life without serious criminal records, without coming to the attention of mental health services, without raising red flags that might have prevented them from finding each other and embarking on their killing spree. The 7 victims, Veronica Knight, Tanya Kenny, Juliet Maikaida, Sylvia Pittman, Vicky Howell, Connie Iordanides, and Deborah Lamb, were remembered by their families not as victims but as vibrant young women whose lives were stolen before they could fully begin. Veronica Knight had dreamed of becoming a teacher. Her family described her as patient and kind, the kind of person who could find beauty in small moments. She had been excited about Christmas 1976, looking forward to spending time with her family. Instead, she died alone and terrified, buried in a shallow grave while her family wondered what had happened to her. Tanya Kenny was just 15 years old. A child really, despite the confident exterior she tried to project. She loved music and dancing, spent hours in her bedroom listening to records and practicing dance moves in front of her mirror. Her mother never recovered from her death, spending the rest of her life haunted by questions about Tanya's final hours. Juliet Maikaida had been planning her wedding when she disappeared. Her fiancé waited for months, hoping she would return, unable to accept that she was gone. When her body was finally discovered at Truro, he attended the funeral but never married. He spent the rest of his life alone, unable to move past the loss of the woman he had planned to spend forever with. Sylvia Pittman had been a nurse, dedicated to helping others, committed to making the world a better place through her work. The irony of her death, killed by men who showed no capacity for empathy or compassion, was not lost on those who knew her. Her colleagues at the hospital struggled to reconcile the kindness she had shown in life with the brutality of her death. Vicky Howell had 2 young children who grew up without their mother. They carried memories of her that faded over the years, replaced by photographs and stories told by family members who tried to keep her alive in their hearts. Both children struggled with the knowledge that their mother had died in such horrific circumstances, that her final hours had been filled with unimaginable terror and pain. Connie Iordanides had been an immigrant, building a new life in Australia, working hard to achieve the dreams that had brought her family to this country. Her parents, devastated by her murder, eventually returned to Greece, unable to remain in the place where their daughter had been so brutally killed. They died without ever fully recovering from the loss. Deborah Lamb's family established a scholarship in her name, determined that something positive should emerge from their grief. Every year, a young woman interested in pursuing higher education received financial assistance that allowed her to chase dreams that Deborah never got to fulfill. It was a small gesture in the face of enormous loss, but it kept Deborah's memory alive in a way that transcended the horror of her death. The impact of the Truro murders extended far beyond the immediate families of the victims. The case fundamentally changed how Australians thought about hitchhiking, how parents warned their children about strangers, how society viewed the vulnerability of young women traveling alone. Highway safety campaigns emerged in the wake of the murders, warning people, especially young women, about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers. The romantic image of hitchhiking as an adventurous form of travel was replaced by stark awareness of the risks involved. Police departments across Australia reevaluated how they handled missing persons cases, recognizing that the failure to connect the disappearances earlier had allowed Christopher and James to continue killing. New protocols were established for tracking patterns in missing persons reports, for sharing information between jurisdictions, for recognizing potential serial killer activity before body counts climbed too high. James William Miller remained in prison for decades after his conviction, becoming an increasingly forgotten figure as time passed and new crimes captured public attention. He never expressed remorse for the murders. He never provided full details about what had happened to each victim. He never explained what psychological process had allowed him to participate in such extreme violence. Criminologists and journalists who attempted to interview James over the years described him as cold and uncommunicative, unwilling or unable to engage with the reality of what he had done. He maintained throughout his incarceration that he had been merely a passive witness to Christopher's crimes, despite overwhelming evidence of his active participation. Christopher Worrell, dead since 1977, became a subject of enduring fascination for those who studied serial killers. His ability to maintain a dual existence, charming boyfriend by day, sadistic killer by night, represented one of the most chilling aspects of the case. People who had known him struggled to reconcile their memories of a friendly, likable young man with the reality of what he had done. Deborah Scoos, who had been Christopher's girlfriend and whose testimony had been crucial to James's conviction, lived the rest of her life under the shadow of the Truro murders. She struggled with guilt over not recognizing the signs earlier, over not preventing the later murders, over having loved a man capable of such evil. She eventually moved away from Adelaide, seeking anonymity in a different city where she could escape the notoriety that came with her connection to the case. The burial site at Truro became, for a time, a macabre tourist attraction. People would drive to the remote area to see where the bodies had been found, to stand in the place where such horror had occurred. Eventually, the landowners closed off access, tired of the constant intrusion, desperate to let the land heal from the dark history that had stained it. A small memorial was erected near the site, listing the names of the 7 victims and the dates they were taken. Families would occasionally visit, leaving flowers and small tokens, keeping the memory of their loved ones alive. But mostly, the memorial stood alone in the Australian bush, a quiet reminder of lives stolen and futures destroyed. The Truro murders remain one of Australia's most notorious serial killer cases, studied in criminology courses, analyzed in true crime documentaries, referenced in discussions about the psychology of killing teams. But for those who lived through the terror of 1976 and 1977, who watched 7 young women vanish from Adelaide streets, who attended the funerals and comforted the devastated families, the case was never just an academic exercise or entertainment. It was a wound that never fully healed. The legal system's handling of the case raised questions that persist to this day. Christopher Worrell escaped justice through death, dying before investigators had uncovered the full extent of his crimes. Some argued that his death was a form of cosmic justice, that his epilepsy, the very condition he had weaponized to appear vulnerable and trustworthy, had ultimately killed him. Others felt cheated that he never faced trial, never had to sit in a courtroom and hear the families of his victims speak about the devastation he had caused. James Miller's life sentence meant he would die in prison, removed from society, unable to harm anyone else. But it also meant that Australian taxpayers would fund his housing, food, and medical care for decades. Some families of the victims struggled with this reality, feeling that execution would have been more appropriate for crimes of such magnitude. Australia had abolished the death penalty in 1967, nearly a decade before the Truro murders, but the case reignited debates about whether some crimes were so heinous that they warranted the ultimate punishment. In the years following the trial, forensic psychologists attempted to understand what made the Worrell-Miller partnership so deadly. Research into killing teams revealed patterns that matched the Truro case almost perfectly. In most killing teams, one member is dominant and the other compliant. The dominant partner, in this case Christopher, provides leadership, charisma, and the ability to manipulate both victims and the outside world. The compliant partner, James, provides validation, support, and often a willingness to engage in violence that exceeds even the dominant partner's capacity. What makes killing teams particularly dangerous is the phenomenon of folie à deux, a shared psychosis where 2 individuals reinforce each other's delusions and violent impulses. In isolation, Christopher might have fantasized about violence but never acted on those fantasies. James might have harbored dark thoughts but lacked the confidence to translate them into action. Together, they created a feedback loop where each murder emboldened them to commit the next, where their shared secret created a bond stronger than normal friendship, where accountability dissolved because guilt could be shared or displaced onto the other partner. The van that Christopher had customized for his crimes was destroyed after the trial, crushed into scrap metal and disposed of. But photographs of it remained in police files showing the modifications he had made, the removed seats, the thick curtains, the chemical stains on the carpet. Investigators who studied those photographs described feeling physically ill, imagining the terror that 7 young women had experienced in that enclosed space, realizing that what looked like an ordinary vehicle had been transformed into a mobile torture chamber. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the time lag between the disappearances and the discovery of the bodies. For 13 months after Veronica Knight's murder, Christopher and James had continued their normal lives while she lay buried in Truro. Her family had spent Christmas 1976 hoping she would return home, not knowing she had been dead for 2 days. The other victims' families had similarly clung to hope long after hope was reasonable, unable to accept that their daughters and sisters were gone forever. When the bodies were finally discovered in January 1978, forensic examination was complicated by the length of time they had been buried. Decomposition had erased many potential clues. Cause of death could be determined in some cases, but not all. The full extent of the torture and sexual assault the women had endured could only be inferred from skeletal trauma and the physical evidence that had survived months in shallow graves. The forensic pathologist who performed the autopsies later described the work as the most difficult of his career. Each victim represented not just a body to be examined, but a young woman who had suffered unimaginably. The clinical detachment required for forensic work became impossible to maintain when confronted with evidence of such prolonged cruelty. Media coverage of the Truro murders was extensive and often sensationalistic. Newspapers ran graphic headlines about the bodies in the bush and the Adelaide serial killers. Television news featured aerial footage of the burial site and interviews with shocked residents of Truro, who couldn't believe their quiet town had become synonymous with horror. Some journalists were criticized for being insensitive in their coverage, for focusing more on the lurid details of the crimes than on the humanity of the victims. Families complained that their daughters were being reduced to statistics, to body counts, to gruesome details rather than being remembered as the vibrant individuals they had been. This tension between public interest and respect for victims became a recurring theme in true crime coverage, with the Truro murders serving as one of the early examples of how media could both inform the public about important cases and exploit tragedy for ratings and sales. The trial itself was covered extensively, with courtroom artists sketching James Miller's impassive face as testimony detailed his crimes. Journalists filled notebooks with quotes from witnesses, creating a written record of the proceedings that would be referenced for decades. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered over 3 hours, methodically built the case against James, demonstrating through timeline analysis, forensic evidence, and witness testimony that he had been an active and willing participant in all 7 murders. Defense attorneys struggled to find a strategy that might save their client from life imprisonment. They couldn't deny his presence during the crimes. The evidence was too strong. They couldn't claim he had been coerced. There was no indication Christopher had threatened or forced James to participate. They couldn't argue diminished capacity. James had never shown signs of mental illness or intellectual disability that would have impaired his understanding of right and wrong. Their only option was to minimize James's role, to paint him as a follower rather than an equal partner, to suggest that without Christopher's influence, James would never have committed any crimes. It was a weak defense, and the jury saw through it. The verdict of guilty on all counts came as no surprise to anyone who had followed the trial. Sentencing provided a moment for victims' families to address the court. One by one, they stood before the judge and spoke about their loss, about the daughters and sisters and friends who would never come home, about the weddings and birthdays and graduations that would never happen, about the grandchildren who would never be born. Their statements were heartbreaking and powerful, transforming the victims from abstract legal concepts into real people whose absence left permanent voids in the lives of those who loved them. James Miller sat through these victim impact statements without visible emotion, staring straight ahead, his face blank, offering no apology and no explanation. The judge's sentencing remarks reflected the gravity of the crimes. He noted that the murders had been premeditated, that they had involved torture and sexual violence, that they had been committed against vulnerable victims who had trusted Christopher and paid for that trust with their lives. He emphasized that James's role had been crucial, that without his participation and encouragement, some or all of the murders might not have occurred. Life imprisonment with no possibility of parole was the harshest sentence available under Australian law. James Miller was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, beginning a prison term that would last until his death. In the decades since the murders, the Truro case has been analyzed in countless academic papers, true crime books, and documentaries. Each examination brings new insights into the psychology of serial killers, the dynamics of killing teams, and the sociological factors that allow such crimes to occur. But beneath all the analysis and academic interest lies a simple, terrible truth. 7 young women died horrifically because 2 men decided their own pleasure was more important than others' lives. 7 families were destroyed because Christopher Worrell's charm concealed a monster and James Miller's weakness allowed that monster to thrive. The town of Truro eventually moved past its unwanted notoriety, though the name will forever be associated with the murders. The burial site has been reclaimed by nature, with native vegetation growing over the disturbed earth, slowly erasing the physical traces of what happened there. But the emotional scars remain, carried by families, by investigators who worked the case, by a community that learned that evil can emerge anywhere. James William Miller died in prison on September 21, 2008, at the age of 67. His death received minimal media coverage, a small obituary noting his passing and his conviction for the Truro murders. There were no mourners at his funeral. His body was cremated and his ashes disposed of without ceremony. Christopher Robin Worrell had been dead for 31 years by the time his partner in crime finally died. Together, they had created a legacy of pain that extended far beyond their own lives, touching hundreds of people who had known the victims, who had worked the case, who had been forever changed by confronting the reality of what humans are capable of doing to each other. The Truro murders stand as a reminder that evil is not abstract or theoretical. It walks among us, sometimes wearing attractive faces and friendly smiles. It can emerge from seemingly normal backgrounds and ordinary circumstances. It can find partnership and collaboration, creating combinations more dangerous than individual malice. The 7 women who died at Truro deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. As daughters and sisters and friends who brought joy and love to those around them, who had dreams and ambitions that were violently stolen from them, who deserved the chance to grow old and experience all the beauty and pain and wonder that life offers. Their names: Veronica Knight, Tanya Kenny, Juliet Maikaida, Sylvia Pittman, Vicky Howell, Connie Iordanides, and Deborah Lamb, should be spoken with respect and sorrow, a memorial in words for lives that ended too soon in the Australian bush. And the names Christopher Robin Worrell and James William Miller should be remembered as well, not celebrated but studied, understood as examples of how darkness can flourish when empathy dies and moral restraints dissolve. The shadows of Truro stretch long across Australian criminal history, a permanent reminder of innocence destroyed and evil unleashed. The case remains relevant not because of its sensational details, but because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the fragility of safety, about the monsters that hide behind normal faces. In the end, the Truro murders are a tragedy without redemption, a story of lives destroyed and futures stolen, of families shattered and communities traumatized. There are no happy endings here, no silver linings to extract from the darkness. There is only memory, the obligation to remember the victims as they were, to honor their lives by refusing to forget them, to learn from their deaths so that perhaps someday we can prevent similar tragedies from occurring. The sun still rises over Truro, casting light across the hills where 7 young women lie in their final resting places. The wind still whispers through the eucalyptus trees, carrying with it the echoes of screams long silenced. And somewhere in that wind, if you listen carefully, you might hear the voices of those 7 women, not crying for vengeance or justice, but simply asking to be remembered as they were, young, hopeful, alive, and loved. That is their legacy. That is what remains when the horror fades and the sensationalism dies away. Human lives, precious and irreplaceable, taken too soon by men who forgot that other people are not objects to be used and discarded but souls deserving of dignity and respect. May Veronica, Tanya, Juliet, Sylvia, Vicky, Connie, and Deborah rest in peace. May their families find what comfort they can in knowing that their stories have been told, their lives remembered, their deaths not forgotten. And may we all remember that monsters are real, that evil exists, and that vigilance and compassion are our best defenses against the darkness that sometimes emerges from the most unexpected places. The Truro murders are over, but the lessons they teach us remain forever relevant, forever necessary, forever true. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Max Guffler Case. When Hell Came Home. There are bodies that vanish without a trace, and then there are bodies that scream their secrets from beyond the grave. What happens when the person you trust to protect you is the one sharpening the knife? We spend our lives believing that evil wears a mask, that monsters lurk in shadows waiting to pounce. But what happens when the monster doesn't hide? What happens when evil sits across from you at breakfast, kisses you goodnight, and knows exactly where you sleep? Tonight, we descend into the nightmare of Max Guffler, a man who didn't just cross the line between human and monster, he erased it entirely. This is the story of how a quiet Austrian town discovered that sometimes the deadliest predator is the one who's been living in your home all along. The Alpine village of Kitzbühel, Austria, sits like a postcard painting against the Tyrolean mountains. Snow-capped peaks pierce the sky while traditional chalets, the landscape, their wooden shutters and flower boxes suggesting nothing but peace and prosperity. This is where the wealthy come to ski, where tourists snap photographs of cobblestone streets, where life moves with the predictable rhythm of church bells and seasonal festivals. But in 1997, this picturesque facade would crack wide open, revealing something so grotesque that even seasoned detectives would struggle to sleep at night. Max Guffler was not supposed to be a killer. That's what made him so terrifying. Born in 1970, Max grew up in a working-class family, the kind that attended Sunday Mass and kept their problems behind closed doors. His childhood friends would later describe him as unremarkable, neither the class clown nor the troubled loner that true crime enthusiasts love to dissect. He was simply there, floating through adolescence with mediocre grades and forgettable hobbies. No torture of animals, no fascination with fire, none of the red flags that criminal psychologists clutch like rosary beads when trying to explain the inexplicable. By his early 20s, Max had settled into the life expected of him. He worked construction jobs, drank beer with colleagues on Friday nights, and dated sporadically. To his neighbors, he was the young man who'd shovel your driveway after a heavy snowfall, the guy who'd help you carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs. His smile was easy, his demeanor calm. Nobody looked at Max Guffler and saw death walking. But behind those unremarkable brown eyes, something was stirring. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It never does. Evil rarely announces itself with trumpets and fanfare. Instead, it seeps in like groundwater through a cracked foundation, silent and patient, waiting for the right moment to flood everything you thought was solid. For Max, that moment came when he met Petra. Petra was 28, working as a clerk at a local insurance office, living alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Kitzbühel. She had straight brown hair that she wore in a practical bob, and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Friends described her as trusting, perhaps too trusting, the kind of woman who saw the good in people even when there was nothing good left to see. When Max approached her at a local pub in early 1996, she was charmed by his attention, flattered by his persistence. Their courtship was textbook normal. Coffee dates at the cafe on Vorderstadt, walks through the Schwarzsee Lake area, dinners at her apartment where she'd cook Wiener Schnitzel and he'd bring wine from the discount store. Petra's friends approved. Finally, she'd found someone stable, someone who seemed genuinely interested in her life, her thoughts, her dreams of maybe opening her own business someday. But approval from friends means nothing when you invite a predator into your bed. The relationship moved quickly. Within 3 months, Max had moved into Petra's apartment. Within 6 months, she'd noticed small changes in his behavior. He grew possessive, questioning her about male colleagues, checking her phone bills, controlling her schedule. When she'd protest, He'd switch tactics, becoming tearful and apologetic, convincing her that his jealousy came from a place of deep love. This was the classic cycle, the one that domestic violence counselors recognize immediately. Tension, explosion, honeymoon period, repeat. Petra tried to leave him twice. The first time, he showed up at her workplace, causing such a scene that her boss threatened to fire her if it happened again. The second time, he simply refused to move out of her apartment, forcing her to sleep on a friend's couch while he occupied her home like an invading army. By early 1997, Petra was trapped, not by chains or locked doors, but by something far more insidious. Fear mixed with exhaustion, isolation mixed with shame. She'd stopped confiding in friends because their advice always led to the same conclusion: leave him, and she couldn't bear to explain why that felt impossible. Max had systematically dismantled her support network, her confidence, her sense of self. She was a shell, and he was the creature living inside that shell, controlling its movements. But Max wasn't satisfied with psychological domination. The darkness growing inside him demanded more. On March 15, 1997, Petra's mother called the police. Her daughter hadn't shown up for Sunday dinner, wasn't answering her phone, and hadn't appeared at work for 2 days. The responding officers knocked on the apartment door. Max answered, looking appropriately concerned. Yes, Petra had left 3 days ago after an argument. No, he didn't know where she'd gone. Maybe to a friend's house? He seemed cooperative, even worried. His performance was flawless. The officers filed their report and moved on. Petra was an adult. She had the right to disappear if she wanted to. Her mother wasn't satisfied, but what could she do? She waited, hope draining like blood from a wound, slow and steady and unstoppable. 2 weeks later, a hiker stumbled upon something in the woods near the Hahnenkamm mountain. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, some strange art installation or discarded film prop. The skin had a waxy quality, and the position seemed too theatrical to be real. But when he got closer, when he saw the insects and smelled the sweet rot of decay, his brain finally processed what his eyes were showing him. It was a woman's body, partially buried under leaves and branches. Her clothes were torn. Her face was frozen in an expression that the hiker would see every time he closed his eyes for the rest of his life. The forensic team arrived within hours. They photographed, measured, collected samples with the mechanical efficiency of professionals who'd learned to divorce emotion from duty. But even the most experienced investigators felt their stomachs tighten when they carefully turned the body over. Petra had been stabbed 17 times. The wounds weren't random. They showed a pattern of rage mixed with deliberation. The medical examiner would later testify that some of the stab wounds had been inflicted while she was still alive, while others came after death, suggesting that her killer had continued attacking her corpse long after she'd stopped breathing. This wasn't murder in a moment of passion. This was annihilation. But the most chilling detail wasn't discovered until the autopsy. When they examined her hands, they found defensive wounds so severe that 2 of her fingers had been nearly severed. Petra had fought. She'd fought hard. And somewhere, her killer had scratches, bruises, evidence written on his skin in the language of her final desperate resistance. The investigation focused immediately on Max Guffler. When police knocked on his door a second time, he let them in with the same cooperative demeanor. But this time, they were looking at his hands, his arms, the visible scratches on his neck that he tried to cover with a high collar. "I got into a fight at a bar," he explained, his voice steady. "Which bar?" they asked. He couldn't remember the name, wasn't sure of the date. The details kept changing, fragmenting, revealing themselves as the lies they were. They arrested him on suspicion of murder. In his apartment, Petra's apartment, they found more than enough evidence to ensure he'd never see freedom again. Bloodstains on the carpet that he tried to scrub away, creating chemical signatures that glowed under luminol like accusatory ghosts. Petra's jewelry hidden in a shoebox. Most damning of all, the murder weapon. A hunting knife tucked behind the water heater, still bearing traces of her blood. During interrogation, Max's mask finally slipped. The cooperative boyfriend vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. He didn't confess immediately, psychopaths rarely do. Instead, he played games, offering partial truths and strategic lies, trying to construct a narrative where he was the victim, where circumstances had forced his hand, where Petra had somehow driven him to violence. But the evidence didn't care about his story. The evidence spoke in absolutes: blood spatter patterns, DNA matches, fiber transfers. Science had become the voice that Petra no longer possessed, testifying from beyond the grave about the horror of her final moments. The prosecutor painted a picture during the trial that was both simple and devastating. Max Guffler had murdered Petra in her own apartment, the place where she should have been safest. He'd stabbed her 17 times, watching her plead for her life, feeling her fight weaken, experiencing her death not as tragedy but as triumph. Then he'd wrapped her body in plastic, driven her to the woods under cover of darkness, and dumped her like garbage. And then he'd gone home and slept in her bed. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Max showed no emotion when the word was read aloud. No tears, no outrage, no relief. Just the blank stare of someone who'd been wearing a human costume for so long that he'd forgotten there was supposed to be something real underneath. But the story of Max Guffler doesn't end with Petra's murder. That was just the beginning, because when investigators started digging deeper into his past, when they began pulling threads to see what else might unravel, they discovered something that turned this case from tragic to truly nightmarish. Petra wasn't his first victim. She wasn't even his second. The human mind craves patterns. We see faces in clouds, hear melodies in random noise, construct narratives to explain chaos. So when Detective Klaus Hoffman sat in the incident room, staring at the case board covered with photographs and timeline markers, his brain kept circling back to a single disturbing question: how does someone kill for the first time? Max Guffler had murdered Petra with a level of brutality that suggested experience. The 17 stab wounds weren't the frenzied work of someone losing control for the first time. They showed practice, progression, a killer who'd already crossed that threshold where another person's suffering becomes entertainment. Hoffman had worked homicides for 20 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. His instincts were screaming that Petra was not victim number one. The detective started where all good investigations begin, with missing persons reports. Austria maintains a federal database of unsolved disappearances, and Hoffman requested access to every case within a 200-kilometer radius of Kitzbühel dating back to 1990. The list was longer than he'd expected: 73 names, 73 faces, 73 families still waiting for answers that might never come. He narrowed the parameters. Females between ages 20 and 40, disappeared in the mid-1990s, last seen in or near small towns where Max Guffler had either lived or worked. 3 names emerged from the data like bodies floating to the surface of a dark lake. The first was Ingrid Schaefer, 24, disappeared in June 1995 from the town of St. Johann in Tyrol, approximately 40 kilometers from Kitzbühel. She'd been working as a waitress at a hotel restaurant, saving money to attend university. According to the missing persons report, she'd finished her evening shift and walked toward the bus stop around 11 p.m. She never boarded the bus. Her purse was found the next morning in a drainage ditch, wallet intact, suggesting that robbery hadn't been the motive. The case had gone cold immediately. No witnesses, no suspects, no body. Just a young woman who'd evaporated into the night like morning fog. Hoffman cross-referenced Max's employment records and felt his pulse quicken. In the summer of 1995, Max had worked construction on a hotel renovation project in St. Johann. Not at the same hotel where Ingrid worked, but close enough. Walking distance, the kind of proximity that makes detectives' instincts sing. The second name was Christina Mayer, 31, disappeared in October 1995 from Wurgel, another small Tyrolean town roughly 30 kilometers from Kitzbühel. Christina had been a divorced mother of 2, working night shifts at a textile factory to support her children. She kissed her kids goodbye one evening, promised to bring them pastries in the morning, and walked out the door into oblivion. Her ex-husband had been the initial suspect. It's always the ex-husband, but his alibi was airtight. He'd been in Vienna visiting his sister, with witnesses and train tickets to prove it. The investigation stalled. Christina's children went to live with their grandmother, learning far too young that sometimes people you love simply vanish, leaving nothing behind but questions and grief. Max's employment records showed he'd worked a construction job in Wurgel that same month, building an extension on a private residence. The timeline overlapped perfectly with Christina's disappearance. The third name made Hoffman's hands shake when he wrote it on the caseboard. Elena Brunner, 26, disappeared in January 1996 from Hall in Tyrol, about 60 kilometers from Kitzbühel. Elena had been a nurse at the local hospital, engaged to be married, planning a summer wedding. She'd left work on a Tuesday afternoon, stopped at the grocery store. Security footage confirmed this, and then seemingly walked into another dimension. Her fiancé had been destroyed by the disappearance. He'd spent months searching, printing flyers, organizing volunteer searches of the surrounding forests. Nothing. Eventually, the searchers had given up. The fiancé had moved away, unable to bear living in a town haunted by her absence. Max Guffler had worked in Hall in Tyrol in late 1995 and early 1996. Another construction job, another convenient overlap, another woman who'd vanished. 3 disappearances, 3 towns, one common denominator. But coincidences aren't evidence, and Hoffman knew that district prosecutors don't build cases on detective instincts. He needed more. He needed bodies. The search teams deployed with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, focusing on forested areas near where each woman had last been seen. They worked methodically, treating the landscape like a crime scene that had been waiting years to reveal its secrets. It took 6 weeks of searching before they found Ingrid Schaefer. She was buried in a shallow grave in the woods outside St. Johann, less than 3 kilometers from where her purse had been found. The years had been cruel to her remains, but the medical examiner could still determine cause of death. Blunt force trauma to the skull, followed by manual strangulation. Her clothes, what was left of them, showed signs of tearing consistent with a violent struggle. The discovery was simultaneous relief and horror for Ingrid's family. They'd spent 2 years oscillating between hope and despair, imagining scenarios where she might still be alive, where she'd suffered amnesia and was living a new life somewhere, where any day now she'd call and everything would be okay. The body ended those fantasies, replacing them with the cold certainty of murder. At least they could bury her now. At least they knew. 3 weeks later, they found Christina Mayer in the Wurgel forest, her skeleton partially scattered by scavenging animals. The medical examiner's report was brief. Cause of death uncertain due to decomposition, but evidence of perimortem trauma to several ribs suggested violent compression, possibly from being stomped on or crushed. Christina had died slowly and painfully. Elena Brunner was discovered last, buried near a hiking trail in Hall in Tyrol. Unlike the others, her body showed signs of attempted concealment beyond simple burial. She'd been wrapped in plastic sheeting and industrial garbage bags, then placed in a pit that had been lined with quicklime. The killer had tried to accelerate decomposition, to erase her from existence so completely that not even bones would remain. But bones are stubborn. They persist. They testify. Elena's cause of death was determined to be sharp force trauma, multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. The pattern was eerily similar to Petra's injuries, though less frenzied. It was as if the killer had been learning, refining his technique, discovering what gave him the most satisfaction. For bodies, for women, for families who'd spent years in agonizing limbo, suddenly thrust into the different but equally brutal reality of confirmed loss. The forensic evidence linking Max to these earlier murders was circumstantial but overwhelming. Soil samples from his work boots matched the burial sites. Fibers from his car, a blue Opel Astra he'd owned in the mid-1990s, were found on clothing fragments from 2 of the victims. Most damning was a forensic analysis of his personal belongings that had been stored at his mother's house. In a box of old clothes, investigators found a shirt with blood spatter that DNA testing matched to Ingrid Schaefer. He'd kept a trophy. Killers often do, unable to resist holding onto physical memories of their crimes. That shirt was Max's confession written in blood. During subsequent interrogations, Max maintained his innocence regarding the earlier murders. He'd killed Petra, yes, that evidence was irrefutable, but the others? He knew nothing about them. Mere coincidence that he'd worked in those towns. Unfortunate that investigators were so desperate to solve cold cases that they'd frame an innocent man. His defense attorney tried the same strategy during the expanded trial, arguing that the prosecution was engaging in a rush to judgment, seeing patterns where none existed. But the jury wasn't convinced. They saw what everyone else saw: a predator who'd been hunting for years, selecting victims who were vulnerable and alone, women who wouldn't be immediately missed, who could disappear into those alpine forests and become nothing more than statistics. The prosecution presented a timeline that was as methodical as it was terrifying. Max Guffler had been killing since at least 1995, possibly earlier. He'd murder approximately every 4 to 6 months, following a pattern of stalking and selection that demonstrated planning and control. These weren't crimes of passion. They were executions, carried out by someone who experienced other people not as humans but as objects that existed solely for his gratification. Between murders, Max would return to his normal life. He'd work construction, drink beer with colleagues, make awkward small talk with neighbors. The mask would slide back into place, convincing everyone around him that he was just Max, boring, forgettable Max, who'd never hurt anyone. But inside, he was counting days until he could hunt again. Psychologists who evaluated Max for the trial struggled to categorize him. He didn't fit neatly into the antisocial personality disorder diagnosis that's slapped on most serial killers. He could feel some emotions, could form attachments, could experience joy and frustration and desire. He simply didn't experience these emotions in relation to other people's humanity. Women were objects to him, toys that he could play with and breaking them gave him pleasure. One psychiatrist testified that Max represented what she called a compartmentalized psychopath. Someone who could genuinely care about his mother, feel loyalty to friends, and still murder strangers without remorse. The part of his brain that should have connected empathy to action was simply not wired correctly. When he looked at Petra, at Ingrid, at Christina, at Elena, he didn't see people. He saw opportunities. The revelations about Max's true nature devastated his family. His mother had to be hospitalized after learning the full extent of his crimes. His younger sister changed her name and moved to another country, unable to bear the association. Friends who'd known him for years reported feeling retroactive dread, going back through memories and wondering if that time he'd seemed angry, or that comment that had seemed strange, had been glimpses of the monster hiding beneath the mundane. The community of Kitzbühel was shattered. This wasn't supposed to happen here in their safe, wealthy, picturesque town. Serial killers belonged to America, to big cities with their urban decay and anonymous masses. They didn't grow up in alpine villages, didn't attend the same schools as your children, didn't wave to you from construction sites. But they did. Max proved they did. The expanded trial lasted 3 months. Witness after witness testified about the victims, who they'd been, what they dreamed of, how their absences had created wounds that never healed. Family members wept on the stand. Friends described the unbearable weight of not knowing, of wondering every single day if their missing loved one was suffering somewhere, calling for help that would never come. And through it all, Max sat expressionless at the defense table, his face a blank page that refused to be written on. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of kidnapping, 4 counts of assault. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under Austrian law. As they led him away in chains, Max turned to look at the gallery where the victims' families sat. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and everyone in that courtroom saw what had been hiding underneath all along. Not anger, not madness, but a terrible empty satisfaction. He'd been caught, yes, but he'd had his fun first. The Justizanstalt Innsbruck prison sits like a concrete scar on the Austrian landscape, housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals. Within its walls, murderers, rapists, and violent offenders live out their sentences in a carefully controlled environment designed to punish and contain. But even in a place dedicated to housing society's worst, Max Guffler stood apart. He was different, and everyone knew it. The other inmates sensed it immediately when he arrived. It wasn't fear exactly. Many of them were violent men themselves, comfortable with brutality. It was something else, something more unsettling. When Max looked at you, there was nothing behind his eyes. No anger, no remorse, no calculation. Just emptiness, as if he were a machine wearing skin. Prison psychologist Dr. Margaret Fisher was assigned to evaluate Max as part of his mandatory mental health monitoring. She'd worked in correctional psychology for 15 years, had sat across from men who'd committed unspeakable acts, had learned to maintain professional distance even when examining the darkest corners of human capacity. But her sessions with Max challenged that detachment in ways she hadn't anticipated. "He's fascinating," she confessed to a colleague over coffee, then immediately felt disgusted with herself for using that word. I mean, clinically speaking, the way he compartmentalizes is unlike anything I've encountered. Dr. Fisher's sessions with Max became a window into a mind that operated on fundamentally different principles than most humans. He would talk about his childhood with apparent normalcy, describing holidays and school and family dinners. He'd express appropriate emotions about his mother, concern for her health, regret that his actions had hurt her. These weren't performances. Brain scans confirmed that he was genuinely experiencing these feelings. But when the conversation turned to his victims, something shifted. Not dramatically, that was the disturbing part. His voice remained steady, his body language relaxed. He simply transitioned from discussing people he cared about to discussing people he'd murdered with the same emotional flatness you might use when describing a trip to the grocery store. "I didn't hate them," he told Dr. Fisher during one session. "That's what people don't understand. Everyone wants me to have hated them, to have been angry, to have some big psychological explanation. But I didn't feel anything toward them at all." "Then why did you kill them?" she asked. Max considered the question with the seriousness of someone pondering what to have for lunch. "Because I wanted to. Because I could. Because when you do it, there's this moment right before they die where everything else disappears. It's the only time I feel completely present." This was the paradox of Max Guffler. He killed not because of overwhelming emotion, but because of its absence. Murder was how he experienced something approximating genuine feeling, a rush of power and control that temporarily filled the emptiness where empathy should have lived. Dr. Fisher's reports painted a picture of a serial killer who didn't fit the traditional profiles. He hadn't been abused as a child. He wasn't motivated by sexual sadism, though there was a sexual component to his crimes. He didn't hear voices or suffer from delusions. He was simply a human being born without the neurological wiring that makes us care about other people's suffering. "If you could go back," Dr. Fisher asked during one session, "would you do anything differently?" Max thought about this for a long moment. "I would have been more careful," he finally said. "The mistakes I made, leaving evidence, keeping that shirt, those were stupid. If I'd been smarter about it, I could have kept going." No remorse. No recognition that the problem wasn't his sloppiness, but his actions. In Max's mind, the tragedy wasn't that 4 women were dead. It was that he'd been caught. But the psychology sessions revealed another disturbing dimension to Max's crimes. They'd been escalating. Dr. Fisher had analyzed the timeline carefully, comparing the physical evidence from each murder. Ingrid Schaefer had been killed relatively quickly, blunt force trauma and strangulation, brutal but over in minutes. Christina Mayer showed signs of longer suffering, her injuries suggesting a more prolonged attack. Elena Brunner's stab wounds indicated increasing deliberation, specific targeting of organs that would cause maximum pain without immediate death. And Petra had endured the worst of all. 17 stab wounds, many inflicted while she was still conscious. Her killer continuing to attack even after death had released her from agony. "You were learning," Dr. Fisher said during a session. "Each murder taught you something, and you applied those lessons to the next one. You were perfecting your technique." Max didn't confirm or deny this. He simply smiled, a small expression that never reached his eyes. "If you hadn't been caught," she pressed, "what do you think would have happened?" "I think you know," he replied. She did know. The escalation pattern was clear. Max had been building toward something worse, something that would have made Petra's murder look merciful by comparison. He'd been limited only by circumstances, the risk of detection, the availability of victims, the practical constraints of time and opportunity. Remove those limitations, and there was no telling where his appetite for violence would have led. The other inmates at Justizanstalt Innsbruck mostly left Max alone. This wasn't respect. It was unease. Even hardened criminals found something repellent about him. During the rare times he interacted with others, his conversation was eerily normal: sports, television shows, complaints about prison food. But there was a performative quality to it, as if he'd studied how humans were supposed to interact and was mimicking the behavior without understanding it. One inmate, serving 20 years for armed robbery, described an encounter in the prison yard. "We were talking about nothing, just passing time, and he asked me why I'd done it, the robberies. I told him I needed money, had debts, felt like I had no choice, and he looked at me like I was speaking another language. He literally didn't understand why I'd need a reason. That's when I realized he was truly fucked up. The rest of us, we did bad things, but we're still human. Him? I don't know what he is." The media coverage of Max's case had been extensive, turning him into a dark celebrity in Austrian true crime circles. Books were written, documentaries filmed, podcasts recorded. Everyone wanted to understand how someone so seemingly normal could be so profoundly broken. But Max refused most interview requests. He'd learned that cooperating with media only fed his notoriety without benefiting him in any way. Besides, he was already getting what he wanted: attention, infamy, a permanent place in the collective memory. His name would be spoken in the same breath as other serial killers, his crimes studied by criminologists and psychologists for decades. He'd achieved a kind of immortality, even if it was the immortality of a monster. The victims' families struggled with different aspects of trauma. Some found closure in his conviction, able to at least move forward knowing he'd never hurt anyone again. Others were consumed by rage, unable to accept that he'd live out his days in relative comfort while their daughters and sisters and friends were bones in the ground. Petra's mother visited the prison once, demanding to speak with Max. The prison psychologist advised against it, warning that he was unlikely to give her the remorse or explanation she sought. She insisted anyway, needing to look into the eyes of the man who'd destroyed her daughter. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. Petra's mother came out shaking, her face drained of color. She never spoke publicly about what was said during those 10 minutes, but friends reported that she seemed hollowed out afterward, as if something essential had been carved away. "I thought seeing him would help," she told her sister later. "I thought maybe if I could understand why, it would hurt less. But there is no why. He's just empty. And now I can't stop thinking about how that emptiness was the last thing Petra saw before she died." Back in his cell, Max maintained a routine. He read books, mostly thrillers and true crime, which he critiqued with the authority of an expert. He exercised, keeping his body in shape despite having nowhere to go. He wrote letters to his mother, who'd initially refused all contact but eventually relented, unable to completely sever the bond between parent and child even when that child was a murderer. In those letters, Max was almost normal. He asked about her health, reminisced about childhood memories, expressed what seemed like genuine love and concern. His mother clung to these letters like lifelines, convincing herself that somewhere inside the monster was still the boy she'd raised. But Dr. Fisher knew better. She'd read those letters as part of her assessment. They weren't proof of Max's humanity. They were proof of his compartmentalization. He could love his mother because she was in a different category than his victims. She was real to him in a way that Petra, Ingrid, Christina, and Elena never had been. The question that haunted Dr. Fisher, that kept her up nights even years after her sessions with Max had ended, was whether he'd been born this way or made. Nature versus nurture, the eternal debate in psychology. She'd read his history exhaustively, interviewed family members, reviewed his medical records. There was no smoking gun, no moment of trauma that could explain his evolution into a killer. Some people, she concluded, are simply born without the capacity for empathy. They're not products of abuse or neglect or societal failure. They're accidents of neurology, brains that developed without the crucial components that make us recognize other humans as equally real and valuable. Society doesn't like this explanation because it suggests randomness, that monsters can emerge from loving families in peaceful towns for no reason at all. But uncomfortable truths are still truths. Max would spend the rest of his life in prison, growing old within those concrete walls. He'd never experience freedom again, never feel sunlight without bars casting shadows, never make another decision that wasn't controlled by guards and schedules and locked doors. This was justice, as much as justice could exist in a world where four women were dead and nothing could bring them back. Yet there was something deeply unsatisfying about this ending. Max wasn't suffering. He was simply contained. He ate 3 meals a day, slept in a bed, watched television, read books. He'd lost freedom, yes, but he still had life. Something he'd stolen from his victims without hesitation or remorse. The families of the dead struggled with this reality. They wanted him to suffer as their loved ones had suffered, wanted him to experience even a fraction of the terror and pain he'd inflicted. But Austrian law didn't allow for torture or execution, only imprisonment. So Max lived on, a monster in a cage, while outside those prison walls, people tried to make sense of the incomprehensible. Some of his fellow inmates reported that late at night, they'd hear him talking to himself in his cell. Not ranting or raving like some of the mentally ill prisoners, but having what sounded like normal conversations, as if someone were responding to his questions and comments. "Who's he talking to?" a guard asked another inmate who'd spent time in the cell next to Max's. The inmate's response was chilling. "I think he's replaying it. The murders. I think he's talking to them, to the women, living it all over again in his head. That's the only time he sounds truly happy." If true, this suggested that even imprisonment couldn't truly contain Max. His body was locked away, but his mind roamed free, returning again and again to those moments of power and control, those precious minutes when he'd held complete dominion over another human life. He was a monster in a cage, yes, but monsters don't need freedom to be dangerous. Sometimes the knowledge that they exist, that they're out there somewhere, is enough to poison the world with fear. The town of Kitzbühel tried to move on, but some stains don't wash out. Tourists still came to ski, wealthy visitors still filled the luxury hotels, and life continued with its predictable alpine rhythms. But something had shifted beneath the surface, a hairline fracture in the foundation of collective security. Parents walked their children to school now instead of letting them go alone. Women carried pepper spray in their purses, keys laced between fingers like makeshift weapons. The easy trust that had once characterized small-town life had been replaced by wariness, a constant low-grade anxiety that spiked whenever a stranger appeared or a shadow fell wrong. The apartment where Petra had died stood empty for 3 years. No one would rent it, despite the landlord's increasingly desperate price reductions. Eventually, he sold the building at a loss to a developer who gutted the interior completely, tearing out walls and floors and fixtures, trying to exorcise the memory of what had happened there. But neighbors still avoided that building, still looked away when passing it on the street, as if the structure itself had been infected by the evil that had occurred within its walls. The forests where the bodies had been found became pilgrimage sites of a sort, though not the kind that brought peace. True crime enthusiasts and dark tourists would make the trek, taking photographs beside the spots where women had been buried, posting them on social media with somber captions about evil and justice. Local authorities eventually erected barriers and warning signs, but they couldn't stop the fascination, couldn't prevent the commodification of tragedy. Ingrid Schaefer's family held a funeral finally, 9 years after her disappearance. Friends and relatives gathered in St. Johann, wearing black beneath gray skies, listening to a priest struggle to find words that could somehow make sense of senseless violence. Ingrid's mother, who'd aged 20 years in the 9 since her daughter's disappearance, stood at the graveside with a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She didn't cry during the service. She was beyond tears now, had exhausted that particular expression of grief years ago. Now there was only anger, cold and permanent, a frozen lake where warmth used to flow. "He took everything," she said at the reception afterward, her voice loud enough that conversation stopped. "Not just my daughter. He took the person I was before. He took my ability to feel safe, to trust strangers, to believe the world is fundamentally good. He murdered Ingrid, but he killed something in all of us too. No one contradicted her because everyone in that room understood exactly what she meant. Christina Mayer's children grew up carrying the weight of their mother's absence like stones in their pockets. The younger one, only 4 when Christina disappeared, had almost no memory of her beyond photographs and stories told by relatives who tried to keep her alive through words. The older child, 7 at the time, remembered everything. The sound of her mother's laugh, the way she'd sing off-key while cooking, the promise of pastries that never came. They visited her grave every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, placing flowers on earth that had finally stopped feeling temporary. Their grandmother, who'd raised them after Christina was gone, would watch these visits with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. They turned out well despite everything, had become kind and thoughtful young adults. But she could see the wound in them, the place where trust should have developed but couldn't, the understanding that people you love can simply vanish and never return. Elena Brunner's fiancé never married. He told friends that he couldn't, that some part of him was still waiting for her to walk through the door with an explanation for where she'd been. Logically, he understood she was dead, had attended her funeral, had watched her coffin lowered into the ground. But emotionally, he remained frozen in that moment of not knowing, unable to move forward into a future that didn't include her. He kept her engagement ring in his pocket, carrying it everywhere like a talisman. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he'd take it out and turn it in the light, watching it sparkle with a promise that would never be fulfilled. Friends worried about him, encouraged therapy, suggested grief counseling. He went through the motions but remained fundamentally unchanged. A man who'd stopped living the day Elena had disappeared. The psychological impact rippled outward in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Domestic violence hotlines in the region reported increased calls. Women who'd been trapped in abusive relationships found the courage to leave, terrified that their partners might be the next Max Guffler, that waiting might mean ending up in a shallow grave. The tragedy had become a catalyst, forcing conversations about danger and control that had been whispered about but never loudly confronted. Self-defense classes proliferated throughout Tyrol. Women of all ages gathered in community centers and gyms, learning how to break holds and strike vulnerable points, preparing themselves for attacks they hoped would never come. The instructors tried to balance empowerment with realism, teaching techniques that might actually work while acknowledging the uncomfortable truth. If someone is determined to kill you, truly committed to violence, sometimes there's nothing you can do but die fighting. Petra had fought. The defensive wounds on her hands proved it. She'd clawed and struggled and refused to die quietly. But it hadn't been enough. The knowledge of this haunted the women in those self-defense classes, a whisper of mortality that no amount of training could completely silence. The media coverage of Max's case spawned a grotesque cottage industry. Books with lurid titles appeared in bookstores, promising insights into the Alpine killer's mind. Documentaries recycled the same interviews and crime scene photographs, each claiming to reveal something new but mostly just repackaging horror for entertainment. Podcasters dissected the case with varying degrees of sensitivity. Their voices piped into the ears of listeners who consumed tragedy like it was a television drama. Some of this coverage was respectful, focusing on the victims' lives rather than the killer's crimes, highlighting the humanity of Petra, Ingrid, Christina, and Elena rather than sensationalizing their deaths. But much of it was exploitative, turning their murders into content, transforming real suffering into background noise for people's commutes and workouts. The victims' families had complex relationships with this media attention. Part of them appreciated that their loved ones weren't forgotten, that their names continued to be spoken even years after their deaths. But another part resented the way their grief had been commodified, packaged and sold to an audience hungry for darkness. "They make documentaries about the killer," Petra's cousin said bitterly during an interview. "They analyze him, try to understand him, give him a platform even from prison. But what about Petra? What about who she was, what she dreamed about, the life she should have had? She becomes just a body, just a victim, defined entirely by how she died instead of how she lived." This tension between remembering victims as people versus defining them by their deaths became a central struggle for the families. They created foundations in their loved ones' names, organized charity runs and scholarship funds, did everything they could to build legacies that transcended murder. But the shadow of Max Guffler loomed over all of it. His crimes the lens through which these women were remembered by strangers. In prison, Max remained largely oblivious to these ripple effects. He understood intellectually that his actions had consequences beyond the immediate, families grieving, communities shaken, but he didn't feel these consequences as failures or sources of guilt. They were simply facts, like the weather or the prison meal schedule, external realities that didn't penetrate the walls he'd built around whatever passed for his emotional core. Dr. Fisher continued to file reports on his mental state, documenting his progress or lack thereof. There was no progress, not really. You can't rehabilitate someone who doesn't believe they've done anything requiring rehabilitation. Max understood that killing was illegal and that society punished it, but he didn't understand why this should matter to him personally. The rules were arbitrary as far as he was concerned, social contracts that constrained his behavior without actually convincing him that his behavior had been wrong. "Do you ever think about them?" Dr. Fisher asked during one of their final sessions before she transferred to a different facility. "The women, do you ever think about what they might be doing if they were alive?" Max considered this. "No," he said finally. "Why would I?" "Because they were people," she replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "They had futures, plans, people who loved them. You erased all of that." "I know," he said. "That's what killing someone means. But you're asking me to care about something that doesn't exist anymore. Their futures aren't real because I ended them. Worrying about what might have been is like worrying about whether unicorns are sad. It's a hypothetical that has no bearing on reality." This was Max's fundamental disconnect. His inability to extend moral consideration to counterfactuals. Yes, he'd killed for women. But once they were dead, they ceased to exist as entities worthy of concern. He couldn't mourn possibilities because possibilities weren't concrete, and his brain only processed concrete realities. Dr. Fisher left that session shaken, questioning whether she'd accomplished anything during years of evaluation and therapy. She'd documented Max's psychology thoroughly, contributed to the academic understanding of compartmentalized psychopathy, written papers that would be cited in textbooks. But had she helped anyone? Had she made the world safer or provided closure to victims' families? The answer, she concluded reluctantly, was no. Some people are beyond help because they don't perceive themselves as broken. Max would live out his days in prison, growing old without ever experiencing remorse, dying eventually without ever understanding why what he'd done was wrong beyond the simple fact that society said so. This realization, that true evil might be less dramatic than fiction suggested, might be simply the absence of something essential rather than the presence of something monstrous, haunted Dr. Fisher long after she closed Max's file and moved on to other cases. The Austrian justice system, meanwhile, grappled with broader questions raised by Max's case. If someone is neurologically incapable of empathy, can they be truly culpable for crimes they committed? If their brain is wired differently from birth, lacking the structures that generate moral consideration, is punishment just, or is it simply society protecting itself from a dangerous anomaly? Legal scholars and ethicists debated these questions in journals and conferences, using Max as a case study while carefully avoiding his name to prevent further glorification. The consensus was unsatisfying. Yes, he was responsible because he'd been capable of understanding that his actions were illegal and harmful, even if he couldn't emotionally connect with that harm. Intent mattered, and Max had clearly intended to kill. The fact that he felt no guilt was irrelevant to culpability. But this didn't resolve the deeper discomfort. What do you do with people who are fundamentally incompatible with human society? Max would die in prison, but what about others like him? People whose brains were wired similarly but who hadn't yet acted on their impulses. Could they be identified early? Should they be? And what would society do with that information? These questions remained theoretical for most people, philosophical exercises without immediate practical application. But for researchers studying psychopathy and antisocial personality disorders, they were urgent and troubling, raising the specter of a future where brain scans might predict criminal behavior before any crime was committed. The town of Kitzbühel eventually erected a small memorial to Max's victims, a stone marker in the town cemetery listing 4 names and dates. It was a compromise between those who wanted to forget and those who insisted that forgetting was a betrayal. The memorial didn't mention how they died or who had killed them. It simply stated that they were remembered, that their lives had mattered, that they were more than footnotes in someone else's story of violence. People would visit occasionally, leaving flowers or small tokens, standing in silence before moving on with their days. The memorial became a place of contemplation, a reminder that evil exists, but so does remembrance, that darkness can be documented without being celebrated. 20 years after his conviction, Max Guffler remains in Justisanstalt Innsbruck, now in his mid-50s. His hair has grayed, his face has lined, but his eyes remain the same. Flat, emotionless, observing the world without truly connecting to it. He reads, exercises, follows his routines. He writes occasional letters to his mother, who's now elderly and frail but still maintains minimal contact with the son who destroyed so many lives. The guards who supervise him keep their distance, both physically and emotionally. They've learned that engaging with Max beyond professional necessity is unsettling, that conversations with him leave you feeling slightly contaminated, as if his emptiness might be contagious. He'll likely die in that prison, decades from now, passing away in his sleep or succumbing to some illness that finally conquers the body that housed such a broken mind. When he dies, there will be obituaries that rehearse his crimes, articles analyzing his legacy, debates about whether his death brings closure or simply marks the end of a chapter that can never truly close. But for the families of Petra, Ingrid, Christina, and Elena, his death will mean little. Their daughters and sisters and friends are already gone, have been gone for decades. Max's continued existence or eventual death changes nothing for them. The wounds remain, scabbed over but never healed, aching in quiet moments when memory ambushes carefully constructed defenses. This is the true legacy of Max Guffler, not the crimes themselves, which are sensational but ultimately just data points in the long history of human violence, but the ripples that continue spreading outward. Every woman who looks over her shoulder walking to her car at night. Every parent who doesn't quite trust that their child is safe, even in their own town. Every person who learned that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs, that sometimes they're just the quiet guy who lives down the street. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles and waves and offers to help carry your groceries. Sometimes it sits across from you at breakfast, ordinary and unremarkable, hiding horror behind a mask of normalcy. And that's the lesson that Kitzbühel learned, that Austria learned, that anyone who studies the case of Max Guffler must eventually confront. The scariest monsters are the ones who look exactly like everyone else, who blend seamlessly into society, who give no indication of the darkness they carry until it's far too late. The 4 women Max murdered deserved better than the deaths they received. They deserved long lives filled with love and accomplishment, grandchildren and retirement, decades of accumulated memories. Instead, they got shallow graves in alpine forests and a killer who felt nothing as he stole their futures. We remember them not because of how they died, but because of how they lived. Petra with her trust and kindness, Ingrid with her ambitions and dreams, Christina with her dedication to her children, Elena with her hope and plans for marriage. They were real, they mattered, and they're gone. That's the story of Max Guffler. Not the psychology of a killer, but the price paid by innocents who crossed his path. Not the mechanics of murder, but the aftermath that echoes through decades, touching lives that never knew his victims but carry their ghosts nonetheless. In the mountains of Austria, the snow still falls every winter, pristine and beautiful, covering the landscape in white that looks pure but never quite erases what lies beneath. Kitzbühel remains picturesque, tourists still come, life continues. But those who know the story walk those forests differently now. They see the beauty, yes, but they also see the shadows between trees, the places where 4 women drew their last breaths, where a monster proved that evil doesn't need fangs and claws to destroy lives. It just needs opportunity and the absence of empathy. And that absence, that hollow space where conscience should live, is more terrifying than any nightmare because it's real. It walks among us, sometimes for years, before anyone notices. By then, it's always too late. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.